It was a typical Saturday afternoon in the heart of New York City. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the crowded streets. People were out and about, hustling from one place to another, absorbed in their own worlds. The sound of cars honking, feet pounding the pavement, and street vendors shouting mixed with the buzz of urban life. But then, something happened that would disrupt the normal rhythm of the day. Something so shocking, so unexpected, it would ripple across the city and eventually, the world. Danny Crash Morgan, the kind of guy you didn't want to meet in a dark alley, was riding his motorcycle through the streets. The roar of his bike was deafening, cutting through the noise of the city like a chainsaw through wood. His leather jacket creaked with each twist of the throttle, and his face was a mask of indifference. Just another biker on a routine ride. But today, Danny wasn't just any biker. Today, he was about to do something that would make him infamous. As he cruised down a narrow street near Central Park, something caught his eye. A fluffy gray tabby cat, sitting calmly on the curb, watching the world go by with a peaceful expression. The cat seemed oblivious to the chaos around it, its green eyes reflecting the sunlight. For a brief moment, Danny stared at the cat, his eyes narrowing with mischief. A twisted smile crept onto his lips as he revved the engine of his bike. With a casual flick of his boot, he kicked the poor cat with all the force he could muster. The cat yowled in pain, tumbling across the sidewalk, its tail flailing helplessly. Pedestrians gasped in shock as they witnessed the brutal act. Some shouted in disbelief. Others pulled out their phones, eager to capture the moment. Danny didn't care. To him, it was just a cat. Just another thing in the world he could take out his frustrations on. He sped off without a second thought, weaving through traffic, the sound of his engine fading into the distance. But what Danny didn't know was that the cat he had just kicked wasn't just any stray. No, this was Star, a cat that belonged to one of the most famous men on the planet, Elon Musk. And when Elon Musk saw the video of Danny's cruel act, it would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Danny Morgan didn't have a typical backstory. The kind of life he led wasn't the kind most people would envy. Unless, of course, they were looking to live on the edge, to break every rule and never look back. Raised in the seedy underbelly of Brooklyn, Danny was no stranger to violence, drugs, and the kind of choices that left scars both inside and out. He had never known his father. The man disappeared before Danny was born, leaving his mother, a chain smoker with a temper that could melt steel, to raise him alone. Danny grew up in a cramped apartment, surrounded by the sounds of yelling, slamming doors, and the occasional police siren. His mother's love was hard to come by. When she wasn't drunk, she was distant, too worn down by life to offer him much more than a cold meal and a few harsh words. By the time he was in high school, Danny had already been arrested twice. The first time was for stealing bikes. Nothing too serious, just a taste of rebellion. The second time was for a street fight that nearly ended in someone getting seriously hurt. By then, Danny had learned that life didn't give you second chances. The world was a brutal place, and if you didn't fight back, you'd get stomped on. After high school, Danny's life took a familiar path. He joined a local motorcycle gang, the Reapers, a group that ruled the streets of Brooklyn with their custom bikes, leather jackets, and unpredictable violence. The gang became his family, a place where he could finally fit in. They gave him respect, something he'd always craved. And in return, he did what they asked. The work wasn't glamorous, smuggling, protection rackets, and the occasional fight, but it paid the bills and fed his ego. Danny was good at what he did. Too good. His reputation as a tough guy spread, and soon, he was one of the most feared members of the Reapers. His nickname, Crash, wasn't just a result of his reckless riding. It was also a testament to the destruction he left in his wake. But as he got older, something started eating away at him. There was a deep emptiness that he couldn't ignore. The nights of drinking, fighting, and sleeping with random women didn't fill the hole inside him. They never did. There was a part of him, a small part, that longed for something more than the constant cycle of violence. But he couldn't escape it. The gang had a tight grip on him, and once you were in, there was no getting out. And then came that day, the day he kicked the cat. Danny had no idea what was about to happen next. In his world, Kicking a stray cat for fun wasn't a big deal. It was just a way to pass the time. A small act of cruelty that made him feel powerful for a few seconds. But what he didn't know was that his life was about to take a turn he never could have predicted. While Danny's life was spiraling through a series of bad decisions, a world away in California, a man named Elon Musk was quietly enjoying the calm before a storm. Elon Musk was, of course, no stranger to the spotlight. He had built an empire from scratch, transforming industries in ways that most people could only dream of. He was the CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and a dozen other companies that redefined the future. His name was practically synonymous with innovation, ambition, and, for better or worse, controversy. But beyond all the business deals, Twitter rants, and revolutionary projects, there was another side to Elon that the public rarely saw. The side that loved simple things. Among those simple things was his cat, Star. Star wasn't just any cat. The fluffy gray tabby was a rescue from a local animal shelter, one of many pets Elon had adopted over the years. But Star was different. This cat had a special place in Elon's life. She wasn't just a pet. She was a companion, a small, furry reminder of the importance of kindness and love in a world that often felt too chaotic. Every morning, as Elon prepared for his busy day ahead, Star would curl up on his lap, purring softly, her green eyes fixed on him with an almost knowing gaze. Despite his packed schedule, Elon made time for Star. He would often share stories about her with his closest friends, tweeting about her every now and then, much to the amusement of his followers. Star just made a mess of my workspace again. It's almost like she's doing it on purpose, he once tweeted with a picture of the cat knocking over his model rockets. To the public, it was endearing. This tech mogul who could be found on Mars one minute and then distracted by a mischievous cat the next. But while the cat's antics were amusing, her presence was soothing to Elon. She represented a grounding force in his high-speed, high-pressure life. And he had big plans for her. On this particular Saturday, Elon had just finished another high-stakes meeting about the future of electric cars when he decided to wind down. He sat in his cozy study, sipping his coffee, while Star hopped onto his desk. She nuzzled against him affectionately before settling down on a pile of papers. It was then that his phone buzzed with a notification. His eyes flicked to the screen. Trending, biker kicks cat. His stomach turned as he tapped on the video. The clip was grainy, filmed on a smartphone by someone on the sidewalk. He could make out a leather-clad man speeding past, his motorcycle revving as he approached the sidewalk where Star was sitting. The next moment, the biker kicked her with brutal force, sending Star tumbling across the concrete. The sound of her yowling echoed in the video, followed by gasps from bystanders who screamed in outrage. Elon's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The world knew Star as his cat, but to the rest of the world, she was just another stray. In that moment, however, she was more than that. She was part of his family, and someone had hurt her, for no reason at all. Fury coursed through him, but it was tempered by something else, something deeper. Sadness. He looked over at Star, who was peacefully lounging on his desk, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. His mind raced. How could anyone be so callous, so cruel? To hurt an innocent animal for amusement? Elon wasn't the type to stand by when someone he cared about was in danger. He had built rockets that reached outer space and cars that could drive themselves, so what was a little biker in the grand scheme of things? He had resources, power, and influence, and he wasn't about to let this slide. This wasn't just about Star. It was about something deeper, a society that allowed cruelty to go unchecked. A world where people didn't think twice before hurting others, whether human or animal. Elon made up his mind in that instant. He would find this biker, and he would make sure there were consequences for his actions. But first, he needed to know more about the man who had hurt Star. The video of Danny kicking Star spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for the outrage to bubble over, fueled by the collective anger of animal lovers, social media warriors, and of course, the press. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was an event, one that captured the attention of millions. People were sickened by the cruelty, and they demanded justice. But justice wouldn't be served simply by online petitions or angry tweets. No, this was bigger than that. Elon Musk wasn't just any billionaire. He was a man who had the means, the power, and the influence to make things happen. When he set his mind to something, it was as though the world had no choice but to follow suit. But at that moment, he wasn't focused on changing the world. He was focused on one thing, and one thing only: finding the man who had hurt his cat. His team had already started working on tracking down Danny. Using a combination of social media analysis, public surveillance footage, and some well-placed contacts, they were able to identify the biker as Danny Crash Morgan. And what they found about Danny was just as unsettling as the video itself. Danny Morgan wasn't a man who had just snapped in a moment of cruelty. No, this was part of a much larger pattern. He was a well-known member of the Reapers, a dangerous motorcycle gang that had been linked to everything from street fights to smuggling operations. Danny's name had been tied to multiple criminal activities over the years, but he had always slipped through the cracks. He was the kind of guy who lived by the rule of survival of the fittest, and right now, the cat was just another weakling to him. Elon stared at the information on his screen, his jaw clenched. He didn't care about Danny's criminal history. All that mattered to him was that this man had hurt Star. It wasn't just a kick, it was a violation. And now, he was going to make sure Danny understood what that felt like. But it wasn't enough to just have the police handle it. Elon was a man of action. He needed to see it through, to make sure that Danny didn't get away with it. It was time to bring the fight to him. Meanwhile, across the country in New York, Danny had no idea what was coming. The day after the video of him kicking Star went viral, Danny was already dealing with the fallout. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Text messages, calls, threats. Everyone from his gang members to random strangers had something to say about what he'd done. Some people wanted him dead. Others wanted him to apologize, though Danny didn't see how an apology would change anything. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong in his eyes. The world was a tough place, and if you weren't tough enough to handle it, you got kicked to the curb, literally. But as the day wore on, the pressure kept building. The media hounded him. His gang began distancing themselves from him, unsure of whether they wanted to be associated with a man who was now a public enemy. Even his closest friends started making excuses to avoid him, afraid of the attention this scandal was bringing. It wasn't until that evening, when he stepped into the dimly lit dive bar where he usually hung out, that he realized just how much his world was shifting. The bartender, a tough guy named Rick who had seen it all, slid a glass of whiskey across the counter without saying a word. Danny took the glass and downed it in one go, his mind racing. That's when Rick finally spoke. "Yo, Danny, you heard about the Musk guy?" he asked, his voice low. Danny furrowed his brow. "Musk? Who the hell's that? Are you serious?" "Elon Musk, man. The billionaire. He's the one who owns that cat you kicked. And trust me, you don't want to mess with him." Danny leaned back in his stool, shaking his head in disbelief. "A billionaire? What's he gonna do? Send me a nasty tweet?" Rick didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening. "You really don't know what you've gotten yourself into, do you?" Before Danny could reply, a low voice from the back of the bar interrupted. "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Danny boy," a man said. Danny's gaze snapped toward the source of the voice, a tall figure emerging from the shadows, wearing a sleek suit and a pair of dark sunglasses. He didn't look like a cop, but the way he carried himself told Danny that this wasn't someone to mess with. "Who the hell are you?" Danny growled, standing up from his stool. The man smiled slightly, his eyes hidden behind the shades. "Let's just say I work for a friend of yours." "Well, not a friend yet, but maybe after tonight, he will be." Danny's pulse quickened. "What the hell do you want?" "I think you know what you've done, Danny, and I think you'll want to make things right. You see, Star, well, she's kind of a big deal to someone with a lot of power. Someone who doesn't like people hurting the things he loves." Danny's stomach twisted. He had heard the rumors about billionaires who had the power to make you disappear, to control entire industries with a single phone call. But this felt different. This felt real. The man took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Elon Musk doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive easily. You have two choices now, Danny. Make it right, or face the consequences." Danny's mind raced. He could handle street fights. He could handle the gang. But this was a whole new world, one he wasn't prepared for. And as the man's words echoed in his head, he realized that this might just be the moment that changed everything. But how far would Elon go to make him pay? The tension was palpable. Danny Morgan stood frozen in front of the mysterious man in the bar, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. He'd heard of powerful people. Hell, he'd dealt with gang bosses who could crush you with a snap of their fingers. But this felt different. The guy in front of him wasn't just some criminal kingpin. He was a professional, a messenger from a world Danny didn't understand. "Look," Danny muttered, trying to regain some composure. "I don't know who you think you are, but if you came here to threaten me, you're wasting your time. I've dealt with worse guys than you." The man didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if he were amused by Danny's bravado. "You don't get it, do you, Danny? This isn't about me. It's about him. You kicked his cat. And if you think you can walk away from that without consequences, you're in for a rude awakening." Danny swallowed, his throat dry. "What kind of consequences are we talking about?" The man leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll find out soon enough. Musk has eyes everywhere. You'll never see him coming." The words hung in the air, heavy with a sense of impending doom. Danny had heard rumors about how far Elon Musk could go when someone crossed him, but hearing it from this guy made it all too real. He wasn't just dealing with an angry pet owner. He was dealing with a man who could bend the world to his will. And for the first time, Danny realized just how big of a mistake he had made. Back in California, Elon Musk sat in the comfort of his high-tech office, but his mind was far from focused on the latest rocket launch or Tesla's earnings report. His thoughts were consumed by Star and the injustice she had faced. His assistant, Zoe, had briefed him on the developments earlier that morning. She had managed to track down the biker's identity, Danny Crash Morgan, a member of the notorious Reaper's motorcycle gang. Zoe had also informed him that the video was already being used in online campaigns to raise awareness about animal cruelty. The public outcry was growing by the hour, and while Elon appreciated the support, he knew that the matter needed a more personal touch. Elon had always been a man of action. When people doubted his vision for Mars, he didn't wait for validation. He built rockets. When the electric car industry seemed impossible, he didn't hesitate. He made electric cars cool. He had an uncanny ability to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. And right now, Danny Morgan was an obstacle that needed to be removed. Not just for Star, but for the principle of it all. Elon picked up his phone and made a call. "Zoe, I need you to reach out to someone in the NYPD. Get me everything on Danny Morgan. I don't care what it takes. No detail is too small." Zoe, who had grown used to Elon's intensity, replied without hesitation. "On it, Mr. Musk." Elon hung up, his thoughts drifting back to the video. He watched it once more, the rawness of Star's pain still fresh in his mind. He needed to make sure that Danny knew the gravity of what he had done. This wasn't a petty crime. It was a statement, a message that needed to be sent. "Mess with the wrong cat, and there are consequences," Elon muttered to himself, a hard edge in his voice. Meanwhile, Danny was back in his small apartment, pacing back and forth as the weight of his situation began to sink in. The strange man at the bar had left without saying much more, but his words continued to echo in Danny's head. What the hell did Musk want from him? Was it money? An apology? A public confession? Or something worse? As he opened a can of beer and took a long swig, Danny's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. He didn't recognize the number, but it didn't take much to figure out who it was from. "You've been warned. There's no running from this. Make it right, or face the consequences." Danny felt his stomach lurch. This was bad. No one had ever made him feel this powerless before. He had enemies, sure, but none of them had this much influence. This was something else entirely. He slammed his beer down on the counter, frustration boiling over. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, determined to get some answers. He needed to find out who these people were and why they were after him. But as he stepped onto the street, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down slowly, and a man in a suit, another one of them, he assumed, looked out at him. "Danny Morgan?" the man asked in a cold, clipped tone. Danny didn't answer, but the man didn't need one. He already knew the answer. I'm here to take you to a meeting, the man continued. Mr. Musk would like a word. Danny felt his heart race. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. There would be no escaping this. Inside the black car, Danny sat in tense silence as it sped through the streets of New York, the city lights blurring past his window. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far beyond his control. The car finally stopped in front of a high-rise building in Midtown. The man in the suit stepped out first and motioned for Danny to follow. They entered the building, and Danny was led through a maze of corridors to an elevator that took them to the top floor. The door opened, and Danny found himself standing in a sleek, modern office. The view of the city skyline from the windows was breathtaking, but Danny barely noticed. His focus was on the man who was sitting behind a large desk, his back to the windows, staring out into the night. Elon Musk didn't look like the kind of guy who would be bothered by something like this. He looked calm, almost disinterested, as he turned in his chair and finally faced Danny. But there was something about his eyes, something sharp and calculating, that made Danny's blood run cold. So, Danny, Elon began, his voice smooth but carrying an underlying edge. You kicked my cat. Danny swallowed hard. I didn't know it was your cat, man. I thought it was just a stray. Elon's gaze hardened. It doesn't matter whose cat it was. What matters is that you hurt something that I care about. And when you hurt the things I care about, there are consequences. Danny's heart raced. He had no idea how this was going to play out, but the last thing he wanted was to get on Elon Musk's bad side. You think you can just make things right with a couple of words? Elon continued, leaning forward slightly. That's not how this works. People like you think they can do whatever they want without facing the fallout. But there's always a price. Danny took a shaky breath, his mind racing for any kind of excuse, any kind of plea that might get him out of this. But he knew deep down that there was no way out. He had kicked the wrong cat, and now he was in the middle of a storm that was way out of his league. Tell me what you want, Musk. I'll do whatever it takes. Elon smiled coldly. I think you'll find that this isn't something you can just fix with money or promises. You're going to have to prove something, Danny. You're going to have to earn your redemption. The office was silent, except for the soft hum of the city below and the faint clicking of Elon Musk's fingers on the armrest of his chair. Danny sat in the plush chair opposite him, a feeling of dread crawling up his spine. He had never felt so out of his depth. Elon leaned back, still observing Danny with those piercing eyes. It was almost as if he was studying him, figuring out whether Danny was worth the effort of redemption or whether he was beyond saving. I want to make one thing very clear, Danny, Elon said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of someone who was used to being in control. This isn't about money. It's not about a public apology or a couple of nice words in front of the cameras. You don't fix something like this with a Band-Aid. Danny clenched his fists in his lap, trying to hide the nerves that threatened to betray him. I get it. Okay? So, what do you want from me? What am I supposed to do? Elon's gaze softened just slightly, but only just enough to let Danny know he wasn't entirely heartless. I want you to prove you're capable of change. I want you to demonstrate that you understand the consequences of your actions, not just to me, but to the world. I want you to earn your redemption. Danny felt a twinge of confusion, his mind scrambling to catch up. What, like some sort of public apology or... No, Elon interrupted, shaking his head slowly. I want you to do something that will make the world see you not as the man who kicked a cat for fun, but as someone who understands the weight of their actions, who takes responsibility. There was a long pause as Danny absorbed Elon's words, his pulse racing. This wasn't just about getting out of trouble. It was about changing the course of his life. Right now, you're known for one thing, violence. The biker gang, the fights, the senseless cruelty to a defenseless animal. But I know you've got more in you than that. I know that if you take this seriously, you can turn your life around. But it's up to you to decide whether you want to be remembered for your mistakes or for your redemption. Danny's mind swirled as he considered his options. On the one hand, he could walk away from this. He could try to disappear, lay low, and keep running from the consequences of his actions. But deep down, He knew that would be a mistake. There was no hiding from someone like Elon Musk, and besides, a part of him, somewhere deep down, knew that this was his chance to change. Elon didn't give him time to deliberate. He stood up abruptly, and Danny followed suit, his heart still pounding. "I have a plan for you," Elon said, his voice suddenly steely, "and if you're serious about making amends, you'll follow it. But make no mistake, this will be the hardest thing you've ever done." Danny nodded, his throat tight. "What do I have to do?" Elon walked over to the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. For a moment, it almost looked like he was lost in thought, contemplating the future. Then, he turned back to Danny. "You're going to work with an organization I've set up," Elon said. "A charity, to be exact. One that helps rescue and rehabilitate abused animals. You'll spend the next 6 months working with them, learning about empathy, patience, and, most importantly, accountability." Danny's mind raced. Charity work? With animals? Elon's eyes narrowed, a flicker of intensity flashing behind them. "You heard me right. You're going to do the hard work. The kind of work that makes you realize what it means to hurt someone and what it takes to make it right." Danny swallowed hard. 6 months? Elon nodded. 6 months of real, physical, hands-on work. You'll start with the basics: feeding, grooming, and caring for animals that have been abused, abandoned, or neglected. After that, you'll move into more difficult tasks: rehabilitating them, helping them trust humans again. You'll spend your days and nights with them, and I expect full dedication. At the end of it, you'll need to show that you've learned something, that you've changed. Danny's chest tightened as the weight of what Elon was asking began to sink in. He had never been good at working for something without immediate payoff. He was used to the fast life, the easy thrills and the quick rewards that came with being a biker. But this was real. This would require effort, dedication, and a kind of humility he had never known before. "And what if I screw up?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elon's gaze hardened once again. "If you screw up, there will be consequences. Not from me, but from the people you've hurt. The ones who've seen the kind of person you've been. And that's the one thing you can't run from, Danny." Danny took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The room felt suffocating now. He knew he had no choice but to accept. There was no going back. You'll have a contact. Someone who will guide you through this process. You'll report directly to them. And when it's over, we'll see if you've earned your redemption. If you haven't, well, I'm sure you can imagine what happens then. Danny nodded slowly, his throat dry. He wasn't sure what kind of man Elon Musk really was, but one thing was crystal clear. This wasn't a man who made idle threats. He wasn't going to let Danny off easy. And for the first time in his life, Danny wasn't sure he could get out of this unscathed. "All right," Danny muttered. "I'll do it." Elon's lips curled into a small smile. "Good. I'll have everything set up for you. You leave tomorrow." Later that evening, as Danny walked back to his apartment, his mind raced with the implications of what was to come. 6 months of hard work with animals. He had no idea how to even begin. But one thing was certain: he couldn't turn back now. It wasn't just about proving to Elon that he was capable of change. It was about proving it to himself. He had spent so long living without a moral compass, drifting from one reckless decision to the next. Maybe this was his chance to find out who he really was, to finally understand what it meant to care about something, to take responsibility, and, just maybe, to make things right. The morning air was crisp and cool as Danny stepped out of the small New York apartment he had been renting for the past few weeks. He had barely slept, the gravity of what he was about to undertake weighing heavily on him. The charity work Elon had assigned him wasn't a simple punishment. It was an opportunity, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for but had no choice but to face. Danny had spent most of his life avoiding responsibility. As a member of the Reapers, he'd learned early that the world didn't owe you anything. The tough survived, and the weak were left behind. Emotions, feelings, and responsibilities were distractions, just another way for people to exploit you. But today, he was about to enter a world that demanded exactly those things: empathy, patience, and, above all, accountability. The words echoed in his mind as he made his way down the street to the address Elon's team had given him. It was a small, unassuming building nestled between a row of aging brownstones. The sign above the door simply read, Hope Haven Animal Shelter, in modest lettering. Danny paused for a moment before entering, taking in a deep breath. He had no idea what to expect, but he had a feeling it wasn't going to be easy. Inside, the atmosphere was a far cry from the gritty, no-nonsense world Danny had come from. The walls were lined with photos of animals, many of them scarred or injured, but all looking hopeful, as if they were waiting for a second chance. It was a world of kindness, not cruelty, and Danny felt like a stranger in a land he didn't belong. As he walked deeper into the shelter, he was met by a tall woman with short, dark hair, her face lit with a warm smile. She wore a simple shirt that said, Rescue First, Ask Questions Later, and a pair of worn jeans. Her presence was calming, almost motherly. You must be Danny, she said, extending a hand. I'm Mia. Welcome to Hope Haven. Danny took her hand reluctantly, feeling the unease settle in his gut. Yeah, that's me. I'm here because I messed up? Mia raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Instead, she gestured to the back of the shelter, where a few dogs could be heard barking from behind a door. Let me show you around first. We've got a lot to do, and it's better to start with the basics. Danny followed Mia as she led him through the shelter, giving him a quick rundown of the place. It wasn't big, but it was clear that every inch of space was used with purpose. There were several rooms for dogs, a small area for cats, and a section for smaller animals like rabbits and guinea pigs. Mia explained that they took in animals from all over the city, focusing on those who had been abused, neglected, or abandoned. This is where you'll be working for the next 6 months, Mia said, opening a door to a room filled with dogs of all shapes and sizes. And it won't be easy. Some of these animals have been through hell. They don't trust people, and they're scared. But we can help them, if you're willing to help. Danny nodded, though a small part of him wanted to bail right then and there. It was one thing to take care of a dog. He'd done that as a kid. But these were animals that had been broken, just like him, and some of them, he could see, were worse off than others. Mia pointed to a large pit bull in the corner of the room, lying on a bed with its back to the door. That's Tank. He's been with us for over a year now. He was found abandoned in a dumpster, starved and beaten. He's a sweet dog, but he doesn't trust anyone. It's going to take time before he'll even let you near him. Danny walked over to the dog slowly, squatting down a few feet away. Tank didn't move. The dog's body was tense, and his eyes stayed fixed on the wall, avoiding any contact. Danny could see the scars along his side and the raw patches on his skin where the fur hadn't grown back. The sight of Tank struck a chord in Danny, a feeling he hadn't expected. This dog had been treated like nothing, a throwaway, just like how Danny had treated so many people in his life. The thought of it hit him harder than he wanted to admit. This dog, like him, deserved a second chance. And for the first time, Danny felt like maybe he was here for a reason. Mia watched Danny for a moment before speaking again. This is the hardest part, Danny. You have to earn their trust. It's not about forcing them to like you. It's about showing them that you won't hurt them. You have to be patient. You have to show them that you can be trusted. Danny nodded, taking another slow step toward Tank. He didn't know how long it would take, or if Tank would ever respond to him, but something inside him stirred. Maybe he wasn't so different from these animals after all. He had been abandoned, beaten down by life, and left to fend for himself. But now, maybe he could learn to trust again. Maybe this was the start of something new. The first few days were excruciating. Danny's body ached from the long hours of cleaning, feeding, and walking the animals. The work was grueling and, at times, heartbreaking. He had to clean up after the animals, some of them still terrified of humans, others aggressive and untrusting. He spent hours sitting quietly in rooms with the animals, allowing them to approach him at their own pace, just like Mia had told him. Tank was still a challenge. The pit bull wouldn't even come near him. But each day, Danny sat a little closer, held out his hand just a little farther. He never forced it, never pushed the dog. And little by little, Tank began to soften. It was small progress, but to Danny, it felt like a victory. There were other animals to care for, too. There was Bella, a small terrier mix who had been rescued from an abusive home, and Max, a tabby cat who had spent months in a cage before arriving at the shelter. Each one had its own story, its own trauma. Some of them would never trust humans completely, but Danny was beginning to understand that it wasn't about fixing them right away. It was about giving them a safe space to heal, just like he needed a safe space to heal. By the end of the first week, Danny was exhausted, both physically and mentally. But there was something else in him now, a quiet determination, a flicker of hope. Maybe he could do this. Maybe he could learn to care again. And maybe, just maybe, he could start to heal the part of himself that had been broken for so long. Mia noticed the change, too. One afternoon, as they took a break from their work, she sat down beside him in the small break room. "You're doing well, Danny," she said, her voice calm. "I know it's hard, but I can see you're starting to get it. You're starting to understand what it means to truly care for these animals." Danny nodded, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "It's not easy. Some days, I don't know if I can do it." Mia smiled softly. "That's the thing about redemption. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying, day after day, even when it's hard." Danny let out a long breath, looking out the window. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he was on the right path. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to live. It was the middle of the second week when Danny first realized he might actually be starting to change. He had just finished his usual morning chores, feeding the animals, cleaning their pens, and taking the dogs out for their morning walks, when he found himself sitting in front of Tank's cage again, staring at the pit bull as he lay curled up on the straw bedding. The dog hadn't made any significant progress in trusting him, but Danny didn't mind as much anymore. At first, the lack of progress had felt like a personal failure. But now, after spending so many hours with Tank, Danny realized something. Trust didn't happen overnight. It was earned, little by little, just like redemption. That morning, as he approached Tank's cage, the dog's ears perked up. He didn't jump up or wag his tail, but his body language had shifted. He wasn't as tense as he had been before. Slowly, Danny crouched down, keeping his movements slow and steady, giving the dog space. "Hey, buddy," Danny muttered under his breath. "You know, I get it. It's hard to trust anyone when you've been through hell." Tank's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment, Danny swore the dog looked at him as if he understood. A flicker of hope surged in Danny's chest. He extended his hand slowly, palm facing down, just a few inches away from Tank. Nothing. Not yet. But for the first time in 2 weeks, Danny felt patient. He didn't rush it. He simply stayed there, watching the dog, until Tank slowly shuffled forward, cautiously sniffing the air. Danny remained still, breathing deeply, watching as Tank's nose came closer to his hand. Then, for the first time, Tank licked Danny's hand. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was a small victory, a moment of connection that made the endless hours of work worth it. Danny's heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Real pride. The kind that wasn't about proving something to the world, but proving it to himself. Mia was nearby, and she had witnessed the whole interaction from the doorway. She stepped inside the room with a quiet smile. "You did it," she said softly, her voice full of quiet approval. "You've made a breakthrough with him." Danny stood up, his legs aching from the crouch, but he couldn't wipe the grin off his face. "I didn't think it would happen." Mia crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "The hardest part is always the first step, but you're getting there. With Tank, with yourself." Danny chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I've spent most of my life being a pretty selfish guy. I'm not exactly the poster child for personal growth." Mia smiled warmly. "I wouldn't say that. You've made a lot of progress. I can see it in the way you've started to interact with the animals, in the way you've started to care for them. It's a big change from the guy who walked in here 2 weeks ago." Danny looked down at his hands, feeling something shift inside him. Maybe Mia was right. Maybe he was changing, even if it was hard to admit. The days started to blur together after that. Every morning, Danny would arrive at Hope Haven and dive straight into his work. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But each day, he felt himself getting a little bit better at it. He grew more patient with the animals, more understanding of their fears, and, most surprisingly, more aware of his own flaws. At the end of the third week, Mia gave him a task that challenged him in a new way. They had recently taken in a pair of cats that had been found abandoned in an alley. The cats were wild and terrified of humans, hissing and clawing at anyone who came near them. They were a challenge even for the experienced staff at the shelter, but Mia trusted Danny enough to give him the responsibility. "You're going to work with them," she said, handing him a set of keys to one of the quarantine rooms. "I think you're ready." Danny looked at her, a little confused. "You want me to work with wildcats?" Mia nodded. "You've spent enough time with the dogs and the other animals. I think you have the patience to help them too." For a moment, Danny hesitated. The cats looked like they'd been through hell, and he wasn't sure he was ready to deal with their wild, unpredictable behavior. But then he thought about Tank, about how he had made that tiny breakthrough. If he could do it with a dog, maybe, just maybe, he could do it with these cats too. The first few days with the cats were chaotic. They scratched at him whenever he entered the room, and no matter how much he tried to gain their trust, they remained feral and unapproachable. But Danny wasn't discouraged. He spent hours sitting in the room, just waiting, letting them get used to his presence. Every day, he made progress, even if it was small, like getting one of the cats to stop hissing at him when he entered. It wasn't until the end of the week that Danny noticed a real change. One of the cats, a small tabby with wide green eyes, finally allowed him to get close enough to pet her. It was a tentative thing, just a brush of his hand against her back, but for Danny, it was another small victory. He stepped back slowly, giving the cat space. He sat down in the corner of the room, trying not to let the overwhelming sense of pride get the best of him. "You did good," Mia said, standing in the doorway and watching the moment unfold. "I knew you had it in you." Danny glanced over at her, a surprised smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to get a cat to trust me, but I guess anything's possible." Mia chuckled, crossing her arms. "It's not about getting them to trust you. It's about showing them you're willing to wait. Trust comes when they're ready, not when we want it." Danny nodded, his chest swelling with something he couldn't quite name. He had spent most of his life trying to force things, forcing people to respect him, forcing situations to go his way. But this was different. With the animals, it was all about patience. And patience, he was learning, was a strength he had never really embraced before. By the end of the fourth week, Danny had earned a place in the shelter. The animals responded to him now. Tank, the dogs, the cats. They all trusted him, in their own way. And though Danny still had his demons, he was starting to believe that maybe he wasn't beyond saving after all. He wasn't the man he used to be, but the road to redemption was long, and he was starting to see that he could actually make it to the end. Danny had spent a solid month at Hope Haven. In that time, he'd come to understand something he hadn't realized before. He wasn't just here to help the animals. They were helping him, too. Every day, as he saw the animals slowly trust him, heal from their traumas, and open up to the possibility of love again, he realized he was doing the same thing. He was learning how to trust, how to care again, and, most surprisingly, how to hope. But hope had a way of being fleeting, of vanishing as quickly as it arrived. Just when things were beginning to settle, when Danny felt like he was starting to make some real progress, the past found him once again. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Danny had just finished cleaning out the dog pens when Mia approached him, her expression more serious than he'd seen it in weeks. She looked a little tense. "Danny, we need to talk," she said, her voice unusually low, a small knot twisted in his stomach. He followed her to the back office, feeling the weight of the conversation already settling in. They sat down at the small desk, the hum of the shelter's activity outside the door. "What's going on?" Danny asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but his heart was already pounding. Mia leaned forward, her hands clasped together on the desk. "We've had a situation," she began slowly. "I've just received a call from a local animal control officer. They're dealing with a case of animal abuse. It's bad, Danny, and they need our help." Danny furrowed his brow. "What kind of help?" "They've got a dog, a pit bull, just like Tank. He's been found chained up in an abandoned warehouse, neglected for weeks, maybe longer. They tried to bring him in, but they couldn't get him to trust anyone. The officer's been calling around, and they think you're the only one who can handle him. A chill ran down Danny's spine. You want me to take in another dog like Tank? You know I'm not. I'm not a miracle worker, Mia. Mia looked at him steadily. I know it's a lot, but I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you were ready. Danny felt conflicted. The idea of taking on another pit bull, especially one that had been through something like this, triggered something deep in him. He didn't want to go back to that place. He didn't want to fail. He didn't want to face the possibility of not being good enough. But the thought of leaving a dog like that to suffer, that cut him deeply. How bad is he? Danny asked, his voice rough. He's in rough shape. We're not sure what kind of history he has with humans, but we think he's been used for fighting. The officer said he's aggressive, but he also mentioned that he's calm when approached correctly. That's where you come in. You've been doing well with Tank, and we think you're the best chance this dog's got. Danny ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this. The idea of working with another dog who might not trust him, or worse, who might lash out in fear or anger, felt like too much. But then again, Mia was right. This dog needed someone. And maybe, just maybe, he needed someone like Danny. He looked at Mia, his decision settling inside him, though his nerves were still raw. All right, he said, his voice quieter now. I'll do it, but I can't promise he'll come around. Mia smiled, relieved. That's all I'm asking, Danny. Just do your best. That's all anyone can do. That evening, Danny drove out with Mia and another volunteer, a young woman named Claire, to the site where the dog was being held. The drive was silent, each of them deep in their own thoughts. Mia occasionally glanced over at Danny, but she didn't speak. She knew that he was struggling with the weight of this task. When they arrived, they were met by the officer, a tall man with a heavy set of keys hanging from his belt. He led them into the warehouse, which was dark and smelled of mildew and decay. In the far corner, there was a pit bull, a large, muscular dog, chained to a post. His fur was matted, and his body was covered in scars, evidence of past battles he had been forced to fight. The dog's eyes glowed in the dim light, fierce but wary, sizing them up from across the room. Danny's stomach tightened as he approached the animal. This was it, the moment when he would either prove he had really changed, or fall back into the same patterns of fear and anger he'd known for years. He took a deep breath and knelt down a few feet away from the dog, keeping his body language calm, not making any sudden movements. The pit bull growled softly, his teeth bared in a warning. Hey, buddy, Danny murmured, his voice low and soothing. It's okay. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm not here to hurt you. The dog didn't move, but Danny stayed where he was, just talking to him in a calm, steady voice. He couldn't rush this. He had to earn this dog's trust, just like he had earned Tank's. Minutes passed, and the air between them thickened with tension. Finally, the dog let out a low whimper, his posture relaxing just a fraction. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Danny slowly extended his hand, palm down, just as he had done with Tank. The dog eyed him suspiciously but didn't snap. He sniffed the air, and then, slowly, he stepped forward. For what felt like an eternity, Danny and the pit bull stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, finally, the dog nudged his nose into Danny's hand. It was tentative, a little unsure, but it was enough to make Danny's heart swell. I got you, boy, Danny whispered. Over the next few days, Danny worked tirelessly with the new dog, whose name they learned was Rocky. He followed the same process he had with Tank: patience, quiet trust building, and time. The difference this time was that Danny had grown. He wasn't the same man who had walked into Hope Haven just a month ago. He wasn't perfect, but he was willing to try, and that made all the difference. By the end of the week, Rocky was responding better to Danny. He wasn't as aggressive, and though he still flinched when anyone moved too quickly around him, he no longer tried to bite or retreat into fear. Danny was making progress, but there was still a long way to go. As the sun set on the following week, Danny sat on the floor next to Rocky, scratching the dog behind the ears as he lay beside him. Mia came over and watched him quietly, a satisfied look on her face. You did good, Danny, Mia said softly. You really did. Danny looked up at her, a small, genuine smile tugging at his lips. I didn't think I could handle it, but I guess I'm not as broken as I thought I was. Mia nodded, her gaze softening. None of us are. We all have scars. But it's what we do with them that counts. Danny looked down at Rocky, who was now lying peacefully beside him, his head resting in Danny's lap. The road to redemption wasn't easy, but Danny was starting to see that maybe, just maybe, it was worth it. Danny had been riding high on the success of his recent work with Rocky, the pit bull. The dog was making progress, and so was Danny. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly doing something that mattered. Hope Haven had become his new purpose, his way of making amends for the mistakes he'd made in the past. But the road to redemption was never linear. Just as he started to feel like he could finally breathe, life had a way of throwing him back into the mess he was trying to escape. It started on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Danny was alone at Hope Haven, cleaning the pins and checking on the animals. Mia had left for a meeting with a potential donor, and Claire had gone to run some errands. The shelter was peaceful, with only the soft sounds of animals moving and the distant hum of the air conditioning to break the silence. That's when the phone rang. Danny wiped his hands on his jeans and picked up the receiver from the counter. Hope Haven, he said, trying to sound professional. There was a pause, followed by a voice he didn't recognize. This is Detective Jameson. I need to speak with Danny Fisher. Is he available? Danny's stomach dropped at the sound of his own name. The last time he'd heard a detective's voice had been over 10 years ago, and it hadn't been for anything good. He tried to keep his voice steady as he responded. This is Danny Fisher. How can I help you? There was a slight hesitation before Jameson spoke again, his voice cool but firm. I'm calling about a case from your past, Mr. Fisher. We've recently come across some new information, and I need to ask you a few questions. Danny's heart pounded in his chest, and his palms grew clammy. He had been expecting this, in the back of his mind. He had known, deep down, that his past would come for him eventually. He'd been running from it for years, but it wasn't just going to disappear. Is this about the incident from 10 years ago? Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The detective didn't answer right away, but Danny could hear the slight shift in his tone. It's related, yes. We've been revisiting some old cases, and it seems there are new developments. I'd like to meet with you in person. Are you available to come down to the station? Danny clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of the past bearing down on him. He hadn't been expecting this to happen now, not when he was starting to finally feel like he was on the right path. But there was no avoiding it. Yeah, I'll come, Danny said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling in his mind. I'll be there in an hour. The ride to the police station felt like the longest drive of his life. Danny kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing. He thought about everything he'd left behind, everything he'd tried to bury, his time in the system, the bad decisions, the people he'd hurt, but mostly, he thought about the family he'd destroyed, the relationships that had crumbled, and the dark cloud that had hung over him for years. When he arrived at the station, he was met by Detective Jameson, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a sharp gaze. He led Danny into a small, windowless room where a single table sat in the center. Danny sat down, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest as he waited for the conversation to begin. Jameson didn't waste any time. He slid a folder across the table to Danny, and Danny opened it to see old photographs from his past, his arrest record, mugshots, and reports of the crimes he'd committed. The memories came flooding back, uninvited and unwanted. We're investigating a possible link between you and a series of unsolved crimes from around the same time as your conviction, Jameson said, his voice even. We believe you may have been involved in something larger than what we initially thought. Danny's mind went blank for a moment. He didn't know what to say. The truth was, he didn't remember much from that time in his life. His addiction had been so overpowering that it had clouded his memory, leaving gaps where his past should have been. All he could remember was the chaos, the violence, the pain, and the guilt. Look, Danny started, his voice rough. I'm not the same guy I was back then. I've done some bad things, and I'm not proud of any of it. But I swear, I'm trying to make up for it. I'm not involved in any of this anymore. Detective Jameson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. I want to believe you, Danny, but there are too many questions that haven't been answered. Too many loose ends. Danny swallowed hard, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. What do you need from me? Jameson studied him for a long moment before speaking. I need you to tell me everything you remember from that time. We've got new evidence that suggests there may have been more people involved. People you knew. And I need to know if you were part of that. Danny's heart began to race. He knew what Jameson was hinting at. He couldn't go back to that place, couldn't let the past drag him under again. But the detective was right about one thing. There were pieces of his past he didn't remember, pieces that could clear his name, or drag him down even further. He felt trapped. What if he didn't remember the truth? What if he had been involved in something worse than he realized? What if the past he had been running from wasn't finished with him yet? After a tense hour, Danny left the police station with more questions than answers. He hadn't given Jameson much. He couldn't risk it. But the detective's words echoed in his mind. People you knew. Loose ends. More involved than you think. Danny knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this derail the progress he'd made at Hope Haven. He couldn't let his past define him anymore. But he also knew that, sooner or later, he'd have to face it head-on. The ghosts of his past weren't going to stay buried forever. Back at Hope Haven, Danny went straight to his room, locking the door behind him. He leaned against it for a moment, his mind still spinning. He had made so many mistakes, burned so many bridges. And now, it seemed like the past was finally catching up with him. He couldn't let it destroy everything he had built. But could he prove he had truly changed? Could he face the dark truth of his past without losing himself again? He wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. The real test of his redemption had only just begun. Danny couldn't sleep. It was the middle of the night, and he lay in his bunk, staring up at the ceiling, his mind in turmoil. The conversation with Detective Jameson kept playing on a loop in his head, each word, each question more unsettling than the last. People you knew. Loose ends. More involved than you think. He had tried to block it out, tried to focus on his work with the animals, on the little victories with Rocky. But the past had a way of clawing its way back to the surface, no matter how much he tried to bury it. And tonight, it felt like that darkness was swallowing him whole. The worst part? He couldn't remember much of what Jameson was asking about. He couldn't recall the people or the events the detective had alluded to, and that terrified him. What if he had been part of something bigger than he realized? Something far worse? Danny had always justified his mistakes by blaming his addiction, telling himself that he wasn't in control back then. But now, faced with the reality of his past, he wondered, was he truly innocent, or was he just another man trying to escape his own guilt? He rolled over and glanced at the clock. It was 2:15 a.m. There was no use in trying to sleep. He was awake, and he needed to do something. He couldn't just let this go, couldn't let the detective's words hang over him without answers. The next morning, Danny showed up early at Hope Haven. Mia was already there, as usual, making her rounds. She greeted him with a tired smile, but when she saw his expression, her smile faded. Something's wrong, she said, walking over to him. Danny didn't want to burden her with this. He didn't want to drag anyone into his mess. But he couldn't keep it inside any longer. He needed to talk about it. Mia, he said, his voice hoarse, I need to tell you something. Something from my past. Mia's eyes softened, her concern growing. You can tell me anything, Danny. You know that. Danny hesitated for a moment, looking around to make sure no one was close enough to overhear. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. A detective came by the other day. He's looking into some old cases. Some stuff from a long time ago. Mia frowned. What kind of cases? Danny rubbed his face with his hands, the weight of it all starting to sink in. Stuff I don't even remember. But he thinks I was involved in something bigger than just the things I got arrested for. And now, I'm not sure if I can trust my own memories. What if I did worse things than I thought? Mia took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his face. Danny, listen to me. You're not that man anymore. Whatever happened back then, it doesn't define you. It doesn't matter how bad things were. What matters is who you are now. The work you're doing here, with the animals, it matters. You matter. Danny swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. He appreciated her words, but it wasn't that simple. He wasn't sure he could outrun the mistakes of his past, no matter how much he wanted to. "I don't know if I can just walk away from it, Mia," he said quietly. "What if it's too late to fix things? What if I'm just lying to myself, thinking I can change?" Mia placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "You can't change what happened, Danny, but you can change what happens next. That's what this place is about. Healing. For the animals, for you, for everyone who needs a second chance." Danny looked down, a lump forming in his throat. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that everything he was doing now meant something, that he wasn't just running from a past he could never escape. But the doubt still lingered, gnawing at him. "I'll figure it out," Danny said finally, forcing a smile. "I have to. I can't let this destroy everything I'm trying to build here." Mia nodded, but there was a look in her eyes, one of quiet concern. "If you need to talk, I'm here. We all are. Don't carry this alone, okay?" Danny managed a weak nod before turning away, his mind already drifting back to the looming uncertainty of his past. The detective's words echoed in his head, louder than ever. Later that day, Danny took Rocky out for a walk, needing the quiet to clear his mind. As he walked along the trails behind Hope Haven, the sound of the dog's steady steps beside him was the only thing keeping him grounded. The world around him felt hazy, like he was walking through a fog. His thoughts kept drifting back to those unanswered questions, the ones that could ruin everything if he wasn't careful. As they reached a small clearing by a stream, Danny stopped and leaned against a tree, letting Rocky roam nearby. He needed answers. He couldn't keep running forever, not when the detective was still out there, digging into his past. But where could he find those answers? Who could he trust to help him make sense of the things he couldn't remember? Then it hit him. There was one person who might know the truth, one person who had been there, who could help him untangle the mess of his past. His older brother, Mike. Mike had been the one person Danny had always looked up to. He'd been the one to try to steer Danny away from the wrong crowd, the one who had warned him about the consequences of his reckless behavior. But Danny had been too stubborn, too lost in his own world of drugs and bad choices. Mike had eventually cut ties with him, tired of watching his younger brother spiral out of control. They hadn't spoken in years, but Danny knew that if anyone could shed light on the dark corners of his memory, it was Mike. It wasn't going to be easy. Mike had every reason to be angry with him. But if there was a chance to clear his name, Danny knew he had to try. That evening, Danny found himself sitting in his truck, staring at the phone in his hand. He had the number saved, but his fingers hovered over the dial button, unsure if he was ready to face the consequences of calling. After a long moment, he pressed the number. The phone rang twice before it was picked up. "Hello?" Danny's heart skipped a beat. It was Mike's voice. His voice, rough and tired but still familiar. "Mike," Danny said, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's Danny." There was a long pause on the other end, and Danny's stomach tightened. "What do you want?" Mike finally asked, his tone guarded. "I need your help," Danny said quickly before Mike could hang up. "I'm trying to understand something. Something from my past. And I—" Mike interrupted him, his voice sharp. "You've got a lot of nerve, Danny. After everything you've done, now you want my help? You want me to clean up your mess?" Danny winced, the sting of his brother's words cutting deep, but he pushed through the pain. "I don't want to go back to who I was," Danny said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm trying to fix things. I need to know the truth. Please, Mike. I need to know what happened." There was silence for a moment. Then, Mike spoke again, softer this time. "I don't know if I can help you, Danny, but I'll meet you. Tomorrow. At the old diner. Noon." Danny's chest tightened with relief. "Thank you. Thank you, Mike." As Danny hung up the phone, a sense of purpose flooded through him. He wasn't sure what he would learn from Mike, but one thing was certain. The truth was coming. And when it did, he would be ready to face it, no matter what. The darkness of his past had always been lurking, but now, for the first time in years, Danny felt ready to step into the light. The old diner was exactly how Danny remembered it. Small, with cracked vinyl booths and a worn-out counter where the coffee never quite tasted right, but it was always hot. He hadn't been here in years, but it felt strangely familiar, like stepping back into a past he'd long tried to escape. As he walked in, the bell over the door jingled, and the scent of greasy food and old coffee hit him instantly. The place was empty save for a lone waitress behind the counter, glancing at him briefly before returning to her crossword puzzle. At the far end of the diner, sitting in a booth by the window, was Mike. Danny's older brother hadn't changed much. His hair was still thick, though streaked with more gray now, and his face was harder than it used to be, lines etched deep from years of frustration and regret. But those eyes, the same hazel eyes that Danny had once admired, still held that spark of familiarity, the spark of a brother who had tried, and failed, to pull him out of the wreckage. Danny took a deep breath and walked over, the weight of the moment settling over him with each step. When he reached the booth, Mike didn't look up immediately. He just continued to sip his coffee, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the cup. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Mike," Danny finally said, his voice quiet but thick with emotion. I don't know how to say this, but I need your help. I can't fix this alone." Mike looked up then, his gaze sharp and unreadable. There was a tension in the air, thick and heavy, and Danny could feel it press in on him. "You've got a hell of a nerve, Danny," Mike said, his voice rough. "After everything you did, after all the lies, the chaos you caused, and now you want me to help you?" Danny swallowed hard, his throat tight. He knew his brother had every right to be angry. He had walked away from him years ago, leaving Mike to deal with the fallout of his mistakes. But Danny had changed. He had to believe that. "I'm not that guy anymore, Mike. I swear. I know I screwed up, but I'm not running from it anymore. I'm trying to make things right. I need to know the truth. What happened back then?" Mike's face hardened. He leaned back in the booth, his eyes never leaving Danny's. "You don't remember, do you?" Mike asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You don't remember what you were involved in?" Danny flinched, feeling the sting of the words. He wanted to say something, to explain, but the truth was, he didn't remember everything. The years of addiction, the mistakes. It had all blurred together in a haze of guilt and regret. "I don't," Danny admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I've been trying to piece it together, but there are things I don't remember, things I need to understand. Detective Jameson came to me. He said there's more to what happened than I know, and I need to know if I was part of it." Mike looked away for a moment, his expression shifting. He didn't seem angry anymore, but there was a sadness in his eyes, a deep, lingering sadness that spoke of years of pain and betrayal. "You're right, there's more you don't remember," Mike said quietly, his voice shaking with the weight of it. "But I don't know if you're ready for it, Danny. You want to know the truth, but the truth comes with a price." Danny leaned forward, the urgency in his chest growing. "I can take it, Mike. Please. I need to know." Mike let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. He seemed to be weighing something, considering whether or not to reveal what Danny had been asking for. The silence between them stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Mike spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were involved in something big, Danny. A lot bigger than you think. The things you got arrested for, that was just the tip of the iceberg. There were people we knew, people we trusted, who were part of something much darker. You were caught up in it, in ways I never wanted to believe." Danny's stomach dropped, and his pulse quickened. Darker? He had been involved in criminal activity before, that much he knew. But this felt like a different level, one that he wasn't sure he could handle. "Who?" Danny asked, his voice hoarse. "Who was I involved with?" Mike hesitated again, his gaze shifting toward the window as if he was afraid to look Danny in the eye. Finally, he spoke, his words clipped and final. "People who used to be close to us. People you thought you could trust. And one of them was involved in some high-profile stuff. Things I'm not even sure you know about. Things that could bring everything crashing down if the wrong people find out." Danny felt a chill run through him. High profile. That word echoed in his mind, and he realized, with growing horror, that Mike wasn't talking about petty crimes or mistakes. He was talking about something much worse. Something that could destroy everything Danny had worked so hard to build. But I don't remember, Danny said, panic rising in his chest. I don't remember any of this. I don't even know who you're talking about. Mike leaned forward then, his voice sharp, his eyes locking with Danny's. You don't remember because you were out of your mind half the time, Mike snapped. But you were part of it, Danny. You were involved in things I never wanted you to be involved in. You'd get a little too drunk, a little too high, and then you'd do whatever you were told. People used your addiction against you. Danny's mind raced as the words hit him like a wave. His hands were trembling, and he felt the weight of the truth crush him from all sides. But I didn't hurt anyone, right? Danny asked, his voice barely audible, his heart pounding in his chest. I mean, I couldn't have. Mike's face tightened, and for a moment, he didn't speak. Then he nodded grimly. You hurt people, Danny. Not in the way you think, but you hurt them. And the longer you keep running from this, the worse it's going to get. Danny felt the world tilt beneath him. All the work he'd done, all the progress he'd made at Hope Haven, it all seemed so fragile now. Was it possible to outrun the damage he'd done? Could he truly change if the past was always going to be there, just beneath the surface? I didn't know, Danny whispered, his throat tight with emotion. I didn't know I was involved in something that big. I thought I was just making bad choices, Mike. I didn't know it was this. Mike's expression softened slightly, but there was still a deep sadness in his eyes. I know, Danny. I know you didn't understand, but it's time to face the consequences. The past is catching up with you, whether you're ready or not. Danny sat back in his booth, feeling the weight of his brother's words pressing down on him. He had hoped for clarity, for something to hold on to in the face of the unknown. But now, the truth felt like an avalanche, and he wasn't sure if he could survive it. The rest of their conversation was a blur. Mike told him more about the people Danny had been mixed up with, names that meant nothing to him, but were clearly important to Mike. He warned Danny that Detective Jameson wouldn't stop digging, but Danny couldn't shake the thought that even if he did face the truth, there would be no escaping the fallout. When he left the diner, the world felt different, more real, more dangerous. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. His past was far from over, and it would follow him until he faced it once and for all. Danny walked out of the diner, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts, a flood of realizations crashing into him with each step. The weight of Mike's words followed him, heavy and unrelenting, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. He had known there was darkness in his past, but now it felt like that darkness was staring him in the face, daring him to confront it. As he got into his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The detective's questions, Mike's warnings. He had been living in denial, thinking he could outrun the consequences. But now, there was no hiding from it. He needed to figure out what to do next. He needed answers. But more than that, he needed to make sure the people he cared about, Mia, the animals, the life he'd started to build, weren't dragged down with him when the truth came to light. Back at Hope Haven, Mia was waiting for him. She had been quiet all day, her concern for Danny obvious in the way she kept stealing glances his way. It had been a strange day, filled with an energy he couldn't quite place. Tension hung in the air, and the animals seemed to pick up on it, their behavior erratic. Even Rocky, who was usually so calm, had been restless. How'd it go? Mia asked as soon as Danny stepped into the office. He could tell she wanted more than just a simple answer, but he wasn't ready to spill everything. Not yet. Not until he figured out what the hell he was supposed to do with all the information swirling inside him. It was a lot, Danny replied, his voice tight. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to drag Mia deeper into the mess. Mike told me some things I wasn't ready to hear. Mia's face softened with concern, her eyes searching his face. What kind of things? Danny swallowed, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't even processed half of what Mike had told him, but he knew he couldn't keep it from her forever. She deserved to know something, at least. Mike says I was involved in some pretty heavy stuff back then, he said slowly, his voice shaky. Things I don't even remember, and I don't know how deep it goes. But it's bad, Mia. Real bad. She didn't react the way he expected. Instead of pushing him for more details or trying to comfort him with empty words, Mia just nodded, as if she already understood. Her silence, though, spoke volumes. "You don't have to deal with this alone," she said softly, her voice steady. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. We always do." Danny shook his head, the guilt threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't deserve your support, Mia. Not after everything I've done. I'm a mess, and I'm afraid it's going to ruin everything." Mia stepped closer, her hand finding his, steadying him. "You're not a mess, Danny. You're a person, and you're trying to do better. That's all any of us can do. The past doesn't define you, okay? The choices you make now, that's what matters." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She was right, but the guilt was like a weight on his chest, a constant reminder that no matter how far he'd come, the past still had its grip on him. It wasn't just the things he'd done. It was the people he had hurt, the lies he had told, and the betrayal that ran deeper than he cared to admit. "Thanks, Mia," he said quietly, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes he couldn't ignore. "We're in this together, Danny. You know that." Later that night, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, Danny found himself pacing the small porch outside his cabin. The air was cool, crisp, and the sky above was a dark canvas filled with stars. He should have been at peace here, surrounded by nature, away from the noise of the world. But tonight, the quiet only amplified the chaos in his mind. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know what you've been up to. We need to talk. Soon." Danny's pulse raced, his fingers gripping the phone tighter. The message wasn't a threat, but the weight of it was unmistakable. It felt like someone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be the detective? Or was it someone else? Someone from his past? Someone who knew more than he realized? He didn't hesitate. He hit the reply button and typed a quick response. "Who is this?" A moment passed before the reply came in, terse and chilling. "You know who I am. I'm the one who's been cleaning up your mess. But we can't do this forever. Meet me tomorrow night. Same place as last time." The message ended with a string of numbers, a location. Danny's stomach dropped as he recognized the address. It was a small warehouse on the outskirts of town, one he had been to before, though he couldn't remember why. It was one of those places he had tried to forget, a part of his life he had shoved into the darkest corner of his mind. His hands shook as he stared at the phone, the weight of the message settling over him. "We can't do this forever." What did that even mean? Who was this person, and what did they want with him? He had to go. There was no choice. This person knew too much, and Danny needed answers. He needed to know how deep this went, who was still pulling the strings. But what if it was a trap? What if it was someone trying to drag him back into that life he'd fought so hard to escape? The next evening, Danny drove out to the warehouse, his mind swirling with a mixture of fear, anger, and anticipation. He didn't tell Mia where he was going. He couldn't risk her getting caught up in whatever this was. He was going alone, just like he had so many times before. Only this time, he wasn't going to let the past control him. The warehouse was just as abandoned as he remembered, cold, industrial, and eerily silent. The only sign of life was a faint light spilling out from beneath the heavy metal doors. As he approached, Danny felt a chill creep down his spine. This wasn't a place for answers. This was a place for reckoning. He pushed the door open, the creaking sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, a figure stood in the shadows, partially obscured by the dim light. "Well, well," the voice said, low and mocking. "The boy finally shows up." Danny's heart raced as the figure stepped into the light. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the face. It was someone from his past, someone he had never expected to see again. The night air was thick with tension as Danny drove back to Hope Haven, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Every thought in his head was a blur of confusion, fear, and anger, all swirling around the encounter with Vic. The warehouse still felt like it was closing in on him, the walls filled with shadows that threatened to swallow him whole. His phone buzzed again, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Mia. Are you okay? You've been gone a while. Call me when you get back. Danny hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. He didn't want to worry her. He didn't want her to know about Vic or the dangerous world he had once been a part of. But he couldn't lie to her either. Not when things were spiraling out of control. He quickly typed a response. I'm fine, Mia. Just needed some time to think. I'll be back soon. Love you. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, tossing the phone aside and focusing on the road ahead. The familiar stretch of highway that led to Hope Haven suddenly felt foreign, as if everything in his life had been turned upside down in just a matter of days. When Danny finally arrived at Hope Haven, the lights were dim, but the place felt peaceful. The animals were quiet, nestled in their enclosures, safe and unaware of the storm brewing outside. For a brief moment, it almost felt like he could go back to pretending everything was normal. But he knew better. The front door creaked open, and Mia was standing in the hallway, her face etched with concern. Danny, she said softly, her voice full of quiet worry. Where have you been? You look, I don't know, different. Danny stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. How could he explain this to her? How could he tell her about Vic, about the people who were still pulling the strings, about the fact that his past might destroy everything he'd worked so hard to build? I had to take care of something, Danny said, his voice strained. Something from my past. But it's over now. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Mia's eyes softened, but Danny could see the doubt in them. She wasn't buying it. You can't keep hiding things from me, Danny, Mia said, her voice quiet but firm. I know something's wrong. You're not the same. Danny swallowed, fighting the urge to break down. He wanted to tell her everything. How Vic had threatened him, how the past was catching up to him, how he had no idea how he could protect her or the animals from it. But the truth was, he couldn't drag Mia into this. Not now, not when everything was so uncertain. I just need a little time to figure things out, he said finally, his voice hoarse. I promise, Mia. I'll make it right. She nodded slowly, though he could see the fear in her eyes. She was worried about him, and for good reason. The problem was, Danny had no idea how to make things right. I'll be here when you're ready, Mia said, her voice softer now. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm in a comforting gesture. But please, Danny, don't shut me out. Danny closed his eyes, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to share his burden, to let her help him bear it. But he knew that the more he pulled her into this, the more likely it was she'd get hurt. I won't shut you out, he said finally, his voice thick. I just need to handle this my way. Later that night, Danny lay awake in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The room was dark and silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. But his mind was anything but quiet. He kept thinking about Vic, about the warning he'd received, about the dark forces that still seemed to be circling him. Vic's words kept replaying in his head. You owe them. We all do. Who were they, really? What kind of people had he gotten involved with all those years ago? And what did they want from him now? The past was never just a memory for Danny. It was a chain, dragging him back every time he tried to escape. No matter how much he wanted to leave it behind, it wouldn't let him go. The next morning, Danny made his decision. He couldn't keep running from his past. He had to confront it head-on, even if it meant putting himself in harm's way. There were too many questions, too many loose ends that needed to be tied up before he could move forward. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Jameson, came the voice on the other end, sharp and direct, like always. Danny Cross, Danny said, trying to keep his voice steady. We need to talk. An hour later, Danny found himself sitting in the same dingy diner where he and Jameson had first met. The detective hadn't changed much. Still the same no-nonsense attitude, still the same hard stare that seemed to see straight through him. But this time, Danny wasn't here to dance around the truth. He needed answers. He needed help. I thought you'd be a little more careful, Cross, Jameson said, taking a sip of his coffee. Vic Riley? Really? You had to get tangled up with that guy again? Danny's jaw tightened. I didn't get tangled up with him. He came to me. And now I'm tangled up in something way bigger than I thought. Jameson raised an eyebrow. Go on. Danny leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. There are people looking for me, Jameson. People from my past. People who know things about me, things I can't remember. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want. Jameson studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. So what do you want from me? Danny felt the weight of the question settle on him. Could he trust the detective? Was Jameson really on his side? Or was he just another player in this dangerous game? Danny didn't have time to second-guess himself. I need you to help me find out what the hell is going on, Danny said, his voice low but urgent. I can't do this on my own. And I can't protect Mia if I don't know who's behind this. The detective didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Danny for a moment longer, as if weighing the truth in his words. Finally, he nodded. All right, Jameson said, his tone reluctant but resolute. I'll help you. But this isn't going to be easy, Danny. And I'm not pulling any punches. You better be ready for what's coming. Danny swallowed hard, the reality of what he was about to face hitting him full force. I'm ready. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint orange glow over Hope Haven as Danny made his way back to the main house. The morning felt different, heavy, like the calm before the storm. He wasn't sure what to expect from his meeting with Detective Jameson, but the fact that Jameson had agreed to help him felt like a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark situation. Mia was still asleep when Danny returned to the house, her face peaceful, unaware of the turmoil that was brewing just outside their door. He didn't want to wake her. Not yet. He needed time to think, to prepare for whatever might be coming next. Danny stepped into the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he poured the hot liquid into the mug. He could hear the faint sounds of the animals in the distance, birds chirping, the rustling of leaves in the wind, but it all felt distant, like a world that wasn't his anymore. He took a slow sip, the warmth of the coffee doing little to ease the cold feeling settling in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't stop. The people from his past were too powerful, too dangerous. And now, with Jameson involved, the stakes were higher than ever. Around noon, Danny received a call from Jameson. The detective didn't waste any time with small talk. You're going to want to meet me at the old warehouse by the docks, Jameson said, his voice clipped. I've got something you need to see. Bring your head on straight. This isn't a game anymore. Danny's heart raced. The old warehouse. That was where everything had started. That was where he had met Vic Riley all those years ago. The place held memories, some of them dark and twisted, others buried so deep he didn't even want to remember. But there was no turning back now. If Jameson had information, he had to go. 15 minutes later, Danny's truck rumbled to a stop outside the old warehouse. The building was a relic of a time long past. Its exterior weathered and covered in graffiti, the windows shattered and boarded up. The whole place had a decaying, haunted feel to it. Danny's boots hit the gravel as he stepped out of the truck, his breath visible in the cold air. The dockyards around him were eerily quiet, the distant sound of water lapping against the shore the only noise breaking the silence. He walked up to the warehouse, his footsteps slow and deliberate. As he approached, he saw Jameson standing by the door, his figure silhouetted against the fading light of the afternoon. The detective didn't look at him right away, but instead stared into the distance, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. You're late, Jameson said, turning to face Danny with an unreadable expression. I don't like waiting. Danny didn't respond. He had no time for Jameson's attitude. The detective had agreed to help him, but Danny knew better than to trust anyone completely. Not after everything he'd been through. Jameson pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly as the heavy metal door groaned against the frame. Inside, the warehouse was dark, save for a few flickering overhead lights that cast long shadows across the floor. We've been watching this place for a while now, Jameson said, his voice lowering as he led Danny further inside. Some interesting things have been happening here. Things that could be connected to your old friends. Danny's pulse quickened. What are you talking about? Follow me, Jameson said, not waiting for Danny to catch up. He walked briskly toward the far end of the warehouse, past empty crates and rusted machinery. At the back of the warehouse, behind a large stack of wooden pallets, was a locked metal door. Jameson pulled out a set of keys from his jacket pocket and unlocked the door with a swift motion. As the door swung open, Danny's eyes widened in disbelief. Behind the door was a small, dimly lit room. But it wasn't just any room. It was filled with maps, photos, and documents, files and papers spread out across tables and pinned to the walls. The entire room looked like an investigative hub, a space designed for one purpose: finding someone. "This is where things get interesting," Jameson said, his voice suddenly serious. "We've been following a trail, your trail, Danny, and we found something that might just be the key to understanding what the hell is going on." Danny stepped inside the room, his eyes scanning the walls. Photos of him from years ago, taken without his knowledge. Documents detailing various interactions he had with people from his past. The more he looked, the more the cold dread spread through his veins. "These people," Danny began, his throat dry, "they've been watching me all along, haven't they?" Jameson nodded, his face grim. "And it's not just you. They're watching anyone connected to you. Mia, the animals, Hope Haven. They'll go after anyone if they think it gets them closer to you." Danny's blood ran cold. His worst fear was coming true. They were coming after everything he cared about, and he was powerless to stop it. "Who are they, Jameson?" Danny demanded. "Who's behind all of this?" Jameson looked away for a moment, as if struggling with whether or not to share more. Finally, he turned back to Danny, his expression hardening. "They're part of something bigger than you realize. A network of people that spans far beyond what you ever knew. And Vic? He's just the tip of the iceberg. You were never just a small-time player, Danny. You were involved in something massive." Danny's head spun. He thought he had left that world behind, but now it seemed like it was pulling him back in, harder than ever. "We need to find out who's calling the shots," Jameson said, his voice now low and determined. "And we need to get ahead of them, before they make their next move." Danny nodded, his mind racing. He didn't know if he was ready for what was coming, but one thing was clear. His life was no longer his own. Whatever game he was caught in, he couldn't play it alone. The next few hours were a blur. Jameson brought Danny up to speed on the investigation, showing him more documents and photos detailing the connections between the people who had been monitoring him. They were part of an underground syndicate, a group involved in everything from organized crime to high-stakes corporate espionage. As the day turned to night, Danny's mind began to settle on one undeniable truth. He needed to take action. And the first step was finding out who was at the top of this web. "We'll need help," Jameson said quietly, breaking the silence. "I've got a contact in the city. He can dig into the records for us. But it's going to take time, and we don't have much of it." Danny stood up from the table, his resolve hardening. "Then we move fast. We can't let them control the narrative anymore. I won't let them hurt Mia, or the animals. Not while I still have a shot at stopping them." Danny couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The revelations Jameson had uncovered were huge, more far-reaching than anything Danny had ever imagined. He'd spent years trying to outrun his past, but now it felt like his past had caught up with him. Worse, it was closing in faster than he could react. By the time Danny got back to Hope Haven, the weight of what he had learned in that dark room at the warehouse hung over him like a thick fog. Every decision he had made over the past few days felt like it had been leading him into deeper waters. And now, he had to make a choice: face the people hunting him, or risk everything he'd built to protect the people he loved. Mia was in the barn when Danny arrived. She had taken to caring for the animals more than usual the past few days, no doubt sensing that something was off. Danny's heart twisted at the sight of her, always the strong one, always carrying the weight of his secrets without asking questions. But now he knew. He couldn't keep hiding from her. He walked into the barn, the soft clop of hooves on wood the only sound between them. Mia was grooming one of the horses, her brow furrowed in concentration, but when she looked up and saw him, the calm expression on her face faltered. "Danny," she said softly, setting the brush down, "I've been worried." Danny took a deep breath, running his hand through his hair. "Mia, I need to tell you everything." Her eyes searched his face for a moment, as if trying to gauge if this was just another one of his evasions. He hadn't been himself lately. He knew she was scared, but she also knew that he had been keeping things from her. "You don't have to tell me everything," Mia said quietly, "but I need you to be honest with me. About what's going on. About Vic. About all of this." Danny's chest tightened. He could no longer deny it. The danger was real, and it was only a matter of time before it would come crashing down. He couldn't do this alone anymore, not when Mia was involved. "Mia," he said, stepping closer, "there are people from my past, dangerous people, who are after me. They know everything about me, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Mia's face paled, but she stood tall. "What do they want, Danny?" Danny hesitated. "They want me. But it's more than that. They've been pulling the strings behind the scenes for years, manipulating things to get to me, to get to us." Mia's lips parted as she processed his words. "Us?" She took a slow step back, shaking her head. "Danny, this is bigger than just you, isn't it? They've been watching us." Danny nodded grimly. "I didn't know it at the time, but yeah, they've been watching everyone connected to me, to Hope Haven, to you." A long silence stretched between them, the weight of the truth sinking in like a stone in water. Finally, Mia broke it, her voice tight. "What are we going to do?" Danny shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out. Jameson and we're working on it. But right now, I just need to make sure you're safe." Mia reached out, her hand brushing his arm. "Danny, you can't protect me if you're running from something. You need to face it." The words hit him harder than he expected. Mia had always been the one to hold things together when his world fell apart. She was right. He couldn't keep running. Not anymore. The next morning, Jameson called, and Danny's stomach twisted as he read the name on the screen. He answered on the second ring. "Danny, we've got a problem." Jameson's voice was low and urgent. "I've been looking into the financials connected to the people after you. We've traced it back to a shell corporation tied to one of your old associates." Danny's heart skipped. "Who? Who is it?" There was a long pause. "Vic Riley." A chill ran down Danny's spine. "Vic? He's not just some thug anymore?" "No," Jameson said, his voice grim. "He's got connections now, serious ones, powerful ones, and they've been using him to get to you." Danny rubbed his forehead, his mind spinning. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. Vic wasn't just some low-level criminal. He was a cog in a much larger machine, and the machine was moving fast. "I need you to meet me at the usual place," Jameson continued. "We need to talk face-to-face. I don't trust the phones anymore." Danny knew what that meant. Jameson was nervous, and when Jameson got nervous, it was never good. The diner was a few miles out of town, a quiet spot where no one would look twice at a man like Jameson or Danny. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in a steady rhythm as Danny slid into the booth across from the detective. Jameson's face was tight, his eyes darting around the room before meeting Danny's. "All right," Jameson said, his voice low. "I've been digging into Riley's operation. There's a bigger syndicate behind him, but it's not just about the money or the power. They're after something specific, and I think it's you." Danny swallowed hard. "What do they want with me?" Jameson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid a manila folder across the table. "I did some digging into your old work. Things you've forgotten, things that were never supposed to come to light. They know about your involvement in the past." Danny stared at the folder for a moment, then opened it, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside were old photographs, some of him, some of people he'd worked with years ago. There were even documents detailing meetings and operations he had been involved in, things he had deliberately erased from his memory, things he had tried to forget. "It's not just about you, Danny," Jameson continued. "They know what you were involved in. They're looking for leverage, something you've been hiding all these years." The implications were terrifying. Danny felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as he flipped through the papers. One name stood out above the rest: Alexander Hale. Danny looked up sharply. "Hale? Are you saying?" Jameson nodded. "Hale's been pulling the strings behind this operation. He's the one who's been orchestrating everything. And it looks like he's been using Vic to get to you." A cold chill spread through Danny's body. Hale, the man who had once controlled everything in Danny's life. And now, it seemed, he was back. and he was using Vic to finish what he had started years ago. That night, Danny sat alone in his truck, the engine humming softly as he stared out into the darkened landscape. The familiar town of Hope Haven seemed distant now, a world away from the storm that was approaching. Mia was safe for now, but for how long? The past was catching up with him, faster than he could outrun it. And with every step he took, he felt more and more like he was running out of time. Danny couldn't sleep. The weight of what he'd learned, coupled with the unrelenting pressure of the situation, kept his mind spinning. Hale, Vic, the syndicate, every connection, every name that had surfaced felt like a thread, pulling him deeper into a tangled web of danger. Mia was asleep in their room, blissfully unaware of just how close danger was creeping. Danny glanced at the clock, 3:42 a.m. The shadows outside the truck cast long, eerie lines across the landscape, and the wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway like dark, twisted figures. It wasn't just the danger from his past that had him restless. It was the feeling that he was losing control. Jameson had provided some answers, but in the process, he had opened up even more questions. Alexander Hale had been a shadow in Danny's life for longer than he realized. The ties between them ran deeper than Danny had ever known. Hale wasn't just an old business partner or criminal mastermind. He was the man who had helped Danny climb to the top. He was the one who'd mentored him, shaped his decisions, and pulled strings behind the scenes. Danny had been living a lie for years, convincing himself that he was free of that life, free of Hale's influence. But now it was clear. Hale had always been watching, always planning. And now, with the syndicate breathing down his neck, Danny had no choice but to confront the past head-on. The next morning, Danny made a decision. The only way to stop Hale and his men was to go straight to the source. He needed to confront Hale, force him to face the consequences of the damage he had caused. But Danny wasn't foolish enough to think this was a one-man job. He needed help, and not just from Jameson. He needed to draw in allies from his past, people who knew Hale, who had crossed paths with him, and who could provide the leverage he needed to make sure Hale didn't walk away unscathed this time. His first call was to a name he hadn't spoken in years, Claire Mitchell. Claire had been Danny's right hand years ago. She was brilliant, resourceful, and fearless, traits that had made her indispensable during the darker days of his past. After everything had fallen apart, she disappeared, taking her skills with her, and Danny had often wondered what had happened to her. Had she kept her hands clean? Or had she gone deeper into the underground world they'd once inhabited? When Danny dialed her number, it rang for what felt like an eternity before her voice came on the line. "Mitchell," she answered, her voice clipped and precise, like it always was. "Claire, it's Danny," he said, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We need to talk." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a low sigh. "I thought you were dead," she finally said, her tone betraying nothing but calm. "I'm still breathing," Danny replied, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "And I need your help." "Help," Claire repeated, and Danny could hear the skepticism in her voice. "You haven't needed my help in a long time. What's going on, Danny?" "It's Hale," Danny said, his words heavy with meaning. "He's back, and he's got people looking for me. People who won't stop until they get what they want. And I think he's trying to finish something he started a long time ago. I need someone who knows him, someone who can get me close enough to take him down." For a long moment, there was only silence on the other end of the line. Then Claire spoke, her voice quiet but serious. "I don't do favors anymore, Danny. You know that." "I'm not asking for a favor," Danny said, his voice firm. "I'm asking for help. If we don't stop Hale, he'll destroy everything. You know what he's capable of." Another pause. Then Claire sighed. "Where do you want to meet?" A few hours later, Danny was standing in a nondescript cafe on the outskirts of the city. The place was empty, the kind of quiet spot where no one would notice a conversation happening in the back booth. When Claire walked in, it was as if time had stood still. She hadn't changed much. Her dark hair was still cut short, her posture still radiating confidence. Her eyes, however, held a coldness Danny hadn't seen before. He couldn't tell if it was because of the years that had passed or the weight of the world she'd been carrying, but something about her seemed different. "Nice to see you again, Danny," Claire said, her voice laced with irony as she slid into the booth across from him. "You've managed to get yourself into a hell of a mess this time." "I'm not the one in the mess," Danny replied, his gaze steady. "Hale's the one who's been pulling the strings." "Don't be naive," Claire said sharply. "Hale always has someone else to do his dirty work. He doesn't do the legwork. But if you're asking for help, then I assume you have a plan." Danny nodded. "I do. We're going after Hale. I need you to help me find him. His network is vast, and I need someone with your talents to navigate it." Claire's lips twisted into a thin smile. "Always the strategist, Danny. Fine. But if I'm helping, I want something in return." Danny leaned in, his voice low. "What's your price?" "You don't have the luxury of bargaining," she replied coolly. "But I'll do it, for old time's sake. But understand this, Danny. If we go after Hale, it's not just you at risk. The entire network will be gunning for us. And when that happens, there's no turning back." Danny nodded, understanding the gravity of what she was saying. Claire was right. There would be no going back. But there was no other choice. Hale had to be stopped. Over the next few days, the plan took shape. With Claire's help, Danny began to piece together the puzzle. They tracked Hale's movements, infiltrating his network of contacts and gathering intel. Every step brought them closer to Hale, but every move felt like they were walking on a razor's edge. One wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. Jameson kept his distance, still working the legal angles and digging into the records, but Danny knew he couldn't rely on Jameson alone. Hale was too smart, too resourceful. He needed a solid strategy, a way to get to Hale without tipping him off. Then, one night, they found a break. A contact of Claire's had overheard a conversation at a shady nightclub, a conversation about a high-stakes meeting between Hale and his inner circle. The deal that would set everything in motion. It was happening in 2 days. "This is our chance," Claire said, looking over the intel with a sharp eye. "We go in, take them by surprise, and we don't leave until Hale is in our hands." The night before the meeting, Danny sat alone in his truck once more, the weight of everything pressing on his chest. The final confrontation was close, but there were still too many unknowns, too many things that could go wrong. But for the first time in a long time, Danny felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for Mia, for Hope Haven, for everything that had been tainted by Hale's reach. The storm was coming, and Danny had no choice but to face it head-on. The city's skyline shimmered under the harsh glow of streetlights as Danny and Claire drove toward the outskirts, where the old industrial complex loomed like a fortress in the distance. It was a place Danny had been before. Years ago, when things were different, when he wasn't running from ghosts of the past. Back then, it had been a strategic location for some of the most lucrative deals he'd been involved in, deals that now seemed so far removed from the life he was trying to rebuild. But tonight, it wasn't about the deals. It was about taking down the man who had once pulled all the strings in his life. Hale, the one person who could destroy everything Danny had fought to protect. Tonight, it was personal. Claire sat beside him, her expression unreadable, fingers drumming lightly on her knee. She hadn't said much since they left the cafe earlier. For someone who had once been in Danny's corner through thick and thin, Claire had grown distant. Danny couldn't blame her. The life they had left behind was a dangerous one, and not everyone could walk away unscathed. "Are you sure this is the place?" Claire asked, breaking the silence. Her eyes scanned the complex ahead, the sprawling buildings casting long shadows under the moonlight. "Yeah," Danny replied, his voice steady but tense. "This is where it's happening. Hale's making a move tonight, and we need to be there when it goes down. If we can take him out now, we'll disrupt the entire operation." Claire nodded, but there was a hint of skepticism in her eyes. "It's not going to be that easy. Hale's too careful. He won't just let you walk in and grab him without a fight." Danny gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the pressure of the moment. He knew Claire was right. Hale wouldn't go down easily, but he couldn't afford to back down now, not when they were so close. The plan was simple, or at least, as simple as it could be. Infiltrate the complex, locate Hale, and neutralize the threat before the deal went through. Claire had managed to get them intel on the meeting, what Hale was planning, who he was meeting with, and what he expected from the transaction. Everything had to go smoothly. One misstep, and everything would unravel. Danny parked the truck behind a cluster of shipping containers, out of sight from the main entrance. The industrial complex was dark and quiet, but he could feel the tension in the air, the silence before the storm. "Ready?" Claire asked, checking her equipment one last time. Silent pistols, knives, and a few other tools of the trade she always carried. "Let's do it," Danny replied. They moved like shadows through the darkness, staying low and quiet as they approached the perimeter of the complex. Danny's heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now, not with everything on the line. As they reached the building that housed the meeting, Claire whispered, "This is it. We go in, grab Hale, and get out. Fast." They slid through a side door that had been left ajar, the faint sound of voices echoing from deeper within the building. Danny's pulse quickened. He could feel the presence of danger, could almost taste it in the air. Claire signaled him to follow, and they moved through the building's narrow corridors with practiced ease. The plan was to head straight for the room where the meeting was supposed to take place. From there, they'd force their way in, take Hale, and extract him before anyone knew what was happening. But as they rounded a corner, something didn't feel right. The air seemed thicker, heavier, and Danny's instincts went on high alert. "Something's off," he muttered under his breath. Claire looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "You think they're onto us?" "I don't know," Danny said, scanning the area ahead. "But stay sharp." They kept moving, but now, every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed deeper. It wasn't long before they reached a large steel door at the end of the hallway. Through a crack in the door, Danny could see figures gathered inside, shadows moving against the dim light. "That's them," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Danny took a deep breath. "We go in hard and fast. On my count." But before he could finish, a loud bang rang through the hall, followed by a sharp hiss of air as a bullet ricocheted off the metal door. Danny cursed under his breath and pulled Claire back behind the wall. "Ambush," he hissed. "They knew we were coming." Claire's expression hardened. "We don't have time for this. We need to move now." But just as she said it, the door burst open, and men in tactical gear flooded into the hallway, their weapons raised. "We've got company," Danny muttered, pulling out his pistol. Plan B. The fight that followed was brutal. Danny and Claire fought side by side, moving in sync like they had done so many times before. Every move was calculated, every step precise. But despite their best efforts, they were outnumbered. Danny ducked behind a stack of crates as a hail of bullets tore through the air, narrowly missing him. Claire was beside him in an instant, firing off shots with deadly accuracy, but the attackers kept coming. "Where the hell is Hale?" Danny growled, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. He couldn't afford to get bogged down here. They had to keep moving, had to find Hale before this got worse. "I don't know," Claire yelled over the gunfire, "but we can't keep fighting forever." Just then, a voice rang out from the far side of the room. A calm, confident voice that Danny had heard countless times before. Hale's voice. "Enough," Hale said, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Put down your weapons. This ends now." Danny's heart dropped. Hale wasn't running. He was watching. Hale stepped into view, flanked by several of his most trusted men. He looked exactly the way Danny remembered. Impeccably dressed, his face smooth and confident, as though he didn't have a care in the world. "Well, well," Hale said, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "It seems my old friend has decided to pay me a visit." Danny clenched his jaw, aiming his gun at Hale. "This ends tonight, Hale. You've been pulling strings for too long." Hale raised an eyebrow, almost amused by the threat. "You think you can stop me? You think you can take down everything I've built just by showing up here with a gun? You've always been a disappointment, Danny." Claire stepped forward, her weapon trained on Hale's men. "You're not getting away with this, Hale," she spat. "Not this time." Hale didn't flinch. Instead, he motioned for his men to lower their weapons. "You're welcome to try," he said, his eyes narrowing, "but you're already too late." Before Danny could respond, Hale's men closed in, and everything went black. The room exploded with chaos. Danny's heart was hammering in his chest as he slammed Hale into the concrete wall, the sickening thud of flesh against metal reverberating through the tight space. Claire was right behind him, pulling herself free from the restraints and grabbing the file from the ground with a quick, determined motion. Hale's men were closing in, guns drawn, their eyes cold with the certainty that they would take down Danny and Claire. But the pair had survived worse, much worse, and now they had no choice but to fight their way out. Claire kicked the nearest guard in the shin, knocking him off balance just long enough for Danny to swing a fist into his jaw. The guard crumpled to the floor with a sharp cry of pain. But they weren't in the clear yet. More men were coming, and the odds were quickly stacking up against them. "Move," Danny shouted, spinning around to face Claire. He could hear the sound of approaching footsteps echoing in the hallway outside. They didn't have much time before reinforcements arrived. Claire nodded sharply, already pulling herself into action. With the file tucked securely in her jacket, she grabbed Danny by the arm and yanked him toward the exit. "This way," she said through clenched teeth, pointing toward a narrow hallway that led deeper into the complex. "We can't go through the main doors. They'll have us trapped." Danny didn't argue. There was no time for that. They bolted down the corridor, running as fast as they could, their footsteps echoing on the cold concrete floors. Behind them, the sound of gunshots rang out, but they didn't stop. Not yet. They made a sharp turn, and Danny nearly lost his footing as they sprinted through the building's back halls. He could hear shouts and the sound of footsteps pounding after them. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion, but there was no time to slow down. Claire glanced over her shoulder and shouted, "They're gaining on us." Danny gritted his teeth. They needed to find a way out fast. His eyes darted around the hallway, searching for any sign of an exit. At the end of the hall, he spotted a maintenance door, slightly ajar. It was their only shot. "Over there," he yelled, pointing toward the door. They sprinted toward it, Danny's heart pounding in his ears. The maintenance door opened with a creak, and they slipped through, into a dark, narrow stairwell that spiraled down into the lower levels of the building. The sound of pursuit was muffled now, but they couldn't afford to relax. "Not yet. I'm not stopping until we're out of this place," Danny said, his voice low but determined. Claire gave him a brief, sharp nod. "I'm with you." The stairwell seemed to stretch on forever, each step echoing louder than the last. As they descended, Danny's mind raced. They had the file. They had the leverage. But the odds were still stacked against them. They couldn't afford to be caught now, not when they were so close to taking Hale down. The door at the bottom of the stairs opened with a soft groan, and they stepped out into a dimly lit hallway. To their left, a narrow alleyway led to what looked like a loading dock. It was their best shot at escaping. But just as they moved forward, they heard a sound that made Danny's blood run cold, the unmistakable click-click of automatic weapons being cocked. He whipped around, his pulse racing. A dozen armed men stood at the end of the hallway, blocking their path. "Hale's men. Not so fast," one of them said, his voice cold and steely. "You really thought you could walk out of here with that file?" Claire's hand slid to the small gun holstered at her side. She glanced at Danny. "We don't have a choice." Danny's mind was working a mile a minute. He knew the file was their ticket out of this nightmare, but there was no way they could fight their way through this many men and still make it out alive. "You don't have to do this," Danny said, trying to buy them some time. He wasn't sure if it would work, but it was their only option. "We can work together. We can take down Hale, help us, and you get a piece of the pie." The man who had spoken earlier smirked, his expression cold and calculating. "You really think we care about Hale's pie? You're a dead man walking, Danny. And so is she." Before Danny could respond, the first gunshot rang out, followed by several more. But Danny didn't flinch. He had been in worse situations than this, and he wasn't about to go down without a fight. The gunfight was chaotic, a blur of movement and noise. Danny and Claire dove for cover as the barrage of bullets came their way. The men were well trained, but so were they. Claire fired first, a single shot that took down one of the closest guards. Danny followed her lead, using the limited cover of the hallway to fire back, hitting two more men. But it was clear, there were too many of them. They needed a way out. Through the loading dock, Claire yelled, gesturing toward the far end of the hall. Danny nodded. On three, they burst out of cover, sprinting down the hall, dodging gunfire as they went. It was a gamble, but it was their only chance. The door to the loading dock swung open, and they darted inside. The area was cluttered with crates and metal shipping containers, offering some semblance of cover. But they couldn't stay here for long. Hale's men would be right behind them. Get the truck ready, Claire ordered, already scanning the area. She spotted an old delivery truck parked in the far corner of the dock. Danny didn't hesitate. He dashed toward the truck, wrenching open the door. He threw the keys in the ignition and cranked the engine to life, just as the first shots rang out from the doorway behind them. The truck roared to life, and Danny slammed his foot on the gas, sending the tires screeching as they tore out of the loading dock. Outside, the night air hit them like a wave, the cool breeze rushing past as Danny maneuvered the truck around the corner of the complex. Claire was already in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. They're coming, Claire said, her voice grim. But we've got a head start. Danny slammed the gas pedal to the floor, pushing the truck faster as it tore down the empty streets. The city stretched out before them, dark and silent, but they couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. Hale's men would be on their tail soon enough. We can't stop until we're sure we're safe, Danny muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Claire looked at him, her face tense but determined. We're not done yet, Danny. We've got what we need to take him down. Now, we just have to make sure it stays that way. Danny nodded, his mind already racing with the next step. They had the file. They had the leverage. Now, they needed to make sure Hale never saw it coming. The truck swerved around another corner, tires squealing against the wet pavement as Danny floored the gas pedal. Claire gripped the passenger seat, her knuckles pale as she kept her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. They had to move fast, stay ahead of Hale's men long enough to reach the drop-off point where they could finally make their next move. The file was still tucked securely in her jacket, and that small sliver of hope was all that kept her going. We're too close to the city, Claire said, her voice tight with urgency. They'll know where we're heading. I know, Danny replied, his jaw clenched. We'll have to shake them. Keep your head down. Don't let them see us coming. The night around them was dark and eerie, the city's skyline looming in the distance like a jagged silhouette. The rain, which had started as a light drizzle, now came down in torrents, slapping against the windshield, making it harder to see and adding a layer of tension to the air. Behind them, the unmistakable hum of an engine grew louder. Danny glanced into the rearview mirror. Hale's men were gaining. Two black SUVs, their headlights cutting through the darkness, were tailing them. The chase had started, and there was no turning back now. Claire looked over at him, her gaze steady. We have a plan, right? Not really, Danny muttered, his eyes never leaving the road. But we've made it this far, haven't we? He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins as he took another sharp turn. They were near the outskirts of the city now, where the roads were quieter, less traveled. Perfect for a quick getaway, if they could lose their pursuers. But Hale's men were relentless. One of the SUVs swerved around a corner, pulling up alongside them, and Danny saw a flash of movement. One of Hale's goons leaning out the window with a gun aimed at them. Hold on, Danny shouted. He swerved the truck to the right, clipping the curb and sending the truck into a wild skid. The SUV attempted to follow, but the slick pavement caught them off guard. It fishtailed, then crashed into a streetlight, metal scraping against metal with a horrible screech. For a brief moment, the truck was clear, but it wouldn't last long. We've got a few more coming, Claire warned, her voice sharp. Danny didn't need to be told. He pushed the truck harder, the engine roaring as he took another tight corner, speeding down an alley between two buildings. He didn't care if they were taking unnecessary risks. The only thing that mattered was keeping the file safe and staying alive long enough to use it. But just as he thought they were getting a break, he saw the second SUV appear at the far end of the alley, blocking their escape. Damn it! Danny cursed under his breath. The truck screeched to a halt, its tires squealing against the wet pavement. The driver of the SUV floored the gas pedal, aiming straight for them. Danny's heart skipped a beat as he realized there was no way around it. "Get ready," he said to Claire, reaching under the seat for the small handgun he'd kept hidden. Claire's hand went to her own gun, and for the first time, Danny saw a flash of something different in her eyes, a hardened determination that matched his own. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about finishing what they'd started. The SUV came at them fast, its headlights blinding. At the last possible moment, Danny jerked the wheel to the left, sending the truck barreling sideways into a nearby dumpster. The impact sent the metal bin flying into the street, narrowly missing the SUV. But they weren't in the clear yet. The truck was stuck, its front tires caught in the metal frame of the dumpster. Danny tried to reverse, but it wasn't moving. They were trapped. "Out! Now!" Claire yelled. Before Danny could react, Claire had already flung open the passenger door and jumped out of the truck, gun in hand. Danny followed suit, his own feet hitting the slick pavement as he took a few quick steps toward the back of the truck. Behind them, the second SUV screeched to a halt. The doors flew open, and Hale's men poured out, weapons drawn, closing in fast. The rain continued to pour, but Danny couldn't afford to let it slow him down. He had one shot at getting out of this alive. "Cover me," Danny shouted to Claire. Claire didn't hesitate. She fired 2 quick shots, each one hitting one of the goons, knocking them back. Danny sprinted for the nearest alley, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But as he reached the corner, he saw another figure. Another SUV, blocking the exit. They were surrounded. Danny felt a cold chill run through him. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Then, out of nowhere, a loud roar echoed through the alley. It wasn't an engine. No, this was different. It was the sound of something far more menacing. Danny's heart skipped a beat as the source of the noise came into view. A massive motorcycle, its headlights cutting through the storm like a beam of light. The rider was clad in black leather, and though Danny couldn't see his face, there was no mistaking who it was. "Hold your fire," came a voice, strong and commanding. The riders of the SUV froze at the sound of the voice. Danny blinked, trying to process what was happening, when he saw the unmistakable logo on the side of the motorcycle, the black and red emblem of the Marauders. "Elon," Danny said, almost disbelieving. Elon Musk, yes, the Elon Musk, was now standing between them and Hale's men. The billionaire entrepreneur had been monitoring the situation from afar, knowing Hale's reach was too vast for Danny and Claire to fight alone. He had sent his private security team to help them escape. "Elon," Claire called out, her voice tinged with surprise. "You're—" "Not the time for questions," Elon replied, his tone cutting through the tension. "Get in the truck now. I'll hold them off." Danny didn't need to be told twice. He ran for the driver's side, pulling open the door and jumping into the seat. Claire was already there, leaning over to help him start the engine. Elon revved his motorcycle, taking off down the alley at full speed, drawing the attention of Hale's men. "Go!" Elon shouted, his voice amplified by a speaker on his bike. "I'll deal with the distractions. Don't stop for anything." With Elon acting as their shield, Danny slammed the truck into gear, pushing the pedal to the floor. The tires squealed as they shot out of the alley, weaving through the maze of back streets. Elon's motorcycle roared in pursuit, taking down any obstacles in their path as he led the way. Behind them, Hale's men tried to regroup, but they were too slow. The Marauders' heavy backup had already sealed off their exit routes, and the truck was making its way to the highway at full speed. But even with Elon's help, they couldn't let their guard down. The truck rumbled down the rain-slicked highway, its headlights barely piercing through the downpour as they sped toward their unknown destination. Elon Musk's motorcycle roared beside them, a dark silhouette in the storm. With his Marauder team securing their flanks, they had managed to escape Hale's men, at least for now. Danny gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Claire sat beside him, her gaze flicking nervously between him and the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign of pursuit. "So, that was Elon Musk," Claire said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the storm and the rumbling engine. She shook her head, still processing what had just happened. "What is he doing here?" Danny glanced over at her, a small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Guess he didn't want to let us take down Hale without a little help, but I'm not complaining. Claire snorted, then shook her head again, disbelieving. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. We're running from Hale's goons, with Elon Musk as our backup. This is not how I imagined my life going. Well, I don't think either of us expected any of this, Danny muttered, his voice low. But the man's got resources, and right now, we need them. Ahead of them, Elon's bike roared again, cutting through the rain. He glanced back, giving them a thumbs up. His team was still ahead, keeping watch on the distant horizon. Elon had been clear about one thing. He wasn't just going to let Hale win. This fight had grown bigger than Danny and Claire's personal vendetta. It was now a war. All right, let's get serious, Elon called over a speaker attached to his bike. There's a roadblock ahead, maybe 5 miles out. You'll need to take the exit before that, head toward the old warehouse district. I'll clear the way. Danny nodded, not questioning the plan. His brain was running on fumes, but he didn't need any more convincing. Hale's men would be right behind them soon enough, and the only way to stop them was to get to the drop-off point where they could make contact with the people who could take down Hale for good. You heard the man, Danny said to Claire. Get ready. She checked her gun and nodded. I'm ready. Just don't let us get cornered. The next few minutes were a blur. As they neared the exit Elon had mentioned, they could see flashing lights in the distance. It wasn't a good sign. It looked like Hale's men had set up a roadblock, just as Elon had predicted. We need to take the back roads, Danny said, swerving onto the exit ramp. The truck's tires screeched as it cut across lanes, but he didn't care. There was no time to lose. Claire braced herself, her eyes scanning their surroundings as they flew down the back roads. The rain had slowed slightly, but the wind whipped against the truck, making it harder to see the road ahead. As they turned another corner, Danny slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a stop. There, just ahead, was the warehouse district Elon had mentioned, a series of abandoned industrial buildings that could offer them some cover. It was the perfect place to lay low for a while, but it was also a perfect ambush point for Hale's men. Elon said he'd clear the way, Claire said, her voice tight. You think he can really get us through? We don't have a choice, Danny replied, glancing nervously toward the dark shadows of the buildings ahead. Let's hope he's as good as his word. As if on cue, Elon's motorcycle shot past them, weaving between the buildings like a shadow in the storm. The sound of his bike's engine echoed off the concrete walls, signaling that he was ready to create some chaos. You're clear, Elon's voice crackled through the speaker in the truck. Move fast and keep low. I'll take care of the rest. Danny didn't hesitate. He slammed the truck into gear and accelerated into the maze of warehouses, the headlights illuminating the dark, abandoned streets. They were moving quickly now, darting between buildings, avoiding the main roads where Hale's men would be expecting them. But they weren't out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. As they sped deeper into the district, the unmistakable sound of gunfire rang out in the distance. It wasn't just one shot, it was a barrage. Hale's men had already reached the area. Go, 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 Claire urged, her voice sharp. Danny's foot pressed harder on the gas. The truck leaped forward, the tires screeching as they took another turn, narrowly missing a pile of debris. But their luck wasn't holding out. Ahead, Danny could see the headlights of an SUV skidding around a corner, cutting them off from any escape. We're boxed in, Danny muttered, his pulse pounding. Claire was already reaching for the door. We can't just sit here. But Danny had a different idea. He had one last trick up his sleeve. We don't need to fight them head-on, Danny said, his voice low, focused. But we need to buy some time. He grabbed the wheel and swerved sharply to the left, heading directly into the alley between two towering industrial buildings. The space was narrow, too narrow for a vehicle to fit comfortably, but Danny pushed the truck through, scraping the sides as he gunned it forward. Behind them, Hale's men swerved to follow, but the alley was too tight. The sound of their vehicles scraping against the walls filled the air, but they couldn't push through at the speed they needed. We can lose them in here, Danny said, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. He could see the SUV struggling to keep up. They can't follow us if we keep moving through these narrow paths. Claire nodded, already keeping watch for any potential escape routes. Let's hope we can make it out. They twisted and turned through the maze of narrow passages, the truck bouncing over debris and potholes as they raced through the dark. The sound of the pursuing SUVs was still behind them, but it was growing fainter with every turn they made. Danny was confident they were losing them, but they had no time to waste. Suddenly, a flash of light blinded him. "What the hell?" Danny's words were cut off as a spotlight hit the front of the truck, blinding him. A second later, the unmistakable roar of helicopter blades filled the air. "They've got a chopper," Claire yelled. "We're not getting out of here like this." Danny's heart sank. A helicopter was no joke. They were going to be trapped unless they could do something about it. The chopper's spotlight swung over the truck, searching for any sign of movement. Danny slammed the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt just before the spotlight caught them. They had a split second. If they could make it to the next set of warehouses, there might be a way to hide. "Get ready," Danny shouted. But just as they were about to make a break for it, the chopper's spotlight fixed on them once more. And in that moment, Danny realized there was no way out. The helicopter's spotlight cut through the downpour like a searchlight, its blinding glow reflecting off the slick surfaces of the old industrial buildings. The sound of the rotor blades echoed, deafening, as the chopper hovered above the abandoned warehouse district. Danny's heart raced. He could feel the pressure mounting. One wrong move, and they'd be caught. They were running out of time. "Stay low, stay quiet," Danny muttered, his voice tight with urgency. Claire, sitting beside him in the truck, gripped her gun with both hands, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror and the surrounding alleyways. The truck had come to a stop, hidden in the shadow of an old, rusting shipping container. Their headlights were off, the engine idling as quietly as it could, but the chopper was getting closer. The hum of the helicopter grew louder, its searchlight swaying back and forth, scanning every corner, every shadow. It was only a matter of time before it found them. Danny's mind raced. He had been in tight situations before, but this was different. Hale's men had them trapped with nowhere to go. If they didn't make it out of here soon, there was a real chance they wouldn't make it out at all. Claire leaned in, her voice low. "We can't just sit here. We need a plan." Danny didn't answer right away. He was trying to think, strategize, when he heard the faint sound of footsteps. His head snapped to the side. "Elon," he hissed. Elon Musk's figure appeared from the shadows, his black leather jacket slick from the rain, but still carrying the same cool confidence. He'd made his way into the heart of the district, staying low to avoid the spotlight's glare. He had no helmet, but his eyes were locked on the truck, signaling for them to stay still. "Not a word, Danny," Elon whispered, walking over to the driver's side. He crouched low, his motorcycle parked in the dark just out of sight. "We've got one shot at this." Danny nodded. "What's the plan?" "The chopper's a problem," Elon said, his voice calm. "But I've got a distraction ready. You need to get to that warehouse on the far side. It's big, can hold you, Claire, and the truck. It's got a back exit." Danny's brow furrowed. "The back exit?" Elon smiled grimly. "We've got to make a run for it. It's the only way to shake them." Claire looked up, eyeing the situation. "How much time do we have?" Elon checked his watch. "Maybe 3 minutes before Hale's men catch up. The chopper's going to make another sweep in 2 minutes. That's your window." Danny's pulse quickened. 3 minutes wasn't much, but it was all they had. "Let's do it," Danny said, slamming the truck into gear. He revved the engine low, just enough to get them moving without making too much noise. The truck lurched forward, tires gripping the slick asphalt as they angled toward the alley leading to the warehouse Elon had pointed out. The helicopter's spotlight swung around once more, but they were already out of the line of sight. For a moment, they seemed to be in the clear. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive, silent structure of rusted metal and crumbling concrete. It was the perfect hiding place, or so Danny hoped. But as they neared the entrance, a loud bang echoed through the air. A bullet ricocheted off the concrete just inches from the truck's front tire. "They spotted us," Claire yelled, her voice full of adrenaline. Danny didn't slow down. He floored the pedal, sending the truck crashing through the metal gates of the warehouse. The gates screeched loudly, bending and crumpling under the force, but they kept going, pushing forward, taking the risk that the sound would draw attention. The chopper's spotlight blinked, then locked onto them once again. Elon, Danny shouted into the comms. I'm on it. Elon's voice came through, calm as ever. Go now. And then, Elon was gone. The sound of his motorcycle revved into the distance. Roar of fury aimed directly at the helicopter. The truck skidded into the dark interior of the warehouse, its tires screeching as it came to a halt near a massive stack of old crates. They were inside. For now, they were safe. But they weren't out of the woods yet. Danny quickly killed the engine, and Claire was already moving, her gun out and scanning the surroundings. Stay quiet, Danny said, his voice low. We wait. Outside, the helicopter hovered over the entrance of the warehouse. Danny could see its shadow flicker across the walls, but it hadn't made its way inside. Elon's distraction had worked, for now. The chopper was hovering, its searchlight swaying in every direction, searching for any sign of movement. The minutes dragged by like hours. Claire, ever the soldier, didn't show any sign of panic, but Danny could see the tension in her posture. She was waiting for something, anything, that would tell her what to do next. Then, the sound of footsteps again, closer this time. Danny stiffened, leaning over to whisper to Claire, "We've got company." She nodded, adjusting her grip on her weapon. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning for anything. Danny slowly opened his door, slipping out of the truck with his gun ready. Claire followed suit, moving silently to the rear of the truck, taking cover behind a stack of old crates. They'd have to be quick if they wanted to escape without getting pinned down. Through the cracks in the warehouse's walls, Danny could see flashes of movement. Hale's men were closing in. They knew they were inside, and they were coming for them. Elon, where the hell are you? Danny whispered into the comms. Elon, Claire called, her voice anxious. Can you hear us? There was a crackle in the air. Then Elon's voice came through. I'm taking care of the chopper. You need to move, now. Get to the back exit, quick. Danny's eyes met Claire's. This was it, the moment of truth. With one last glance toward the entrance of the warehouse, they bolted. Danny led the way, ducking between crates and barrels, careful to avoid making any noise. Every footstep felt like it could be their last, but they kept going. In the distance, the whir of the helicopter blades was growing fainter. Elon was doing his part, pulling the chopper's attention away from them. But Hale's men were still a threat, and they needed to move fast. They reached the back of the warehouse, where a rusted door stood ajar, a dim light spilling from the crack. It was their only way out. On three, Danny whispered. Claire nodded, her hand on the door. 1, 2, 3. Danny counted. They burst through the door, and what awaited them wasn't safety. It was chaos. Outside, Hale's men were closing in, ready to storm the warehouse. But what they didn't expect was the line of marauder bikes, waiting with engines revved and guns drawn. Elon Musk's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. You wanted a fight, Hale? Well, you got one. The night had become a war zone. Rain hammered the streets in relentless sheets, turning the world outside into a blur of shadows and flashing lights. Danny's heart pounded as he crouched behind a rusted barrel, the cold steel biting into his skin. Claire stood next to him, her back pressed against the wall of the warehouse, eyes sharp as she scanned the battlefield ahead. This was it, the final showdown. They had nowhere to go, no backup, no more tricks. Just the fight that would determine their futures. A few yards away, Hale's men were spread out in tactical formation. They were moving in slowly, cautiously, as if expecting the unexpected. Their guns were drawn, their eyes locked on every corner of the warehouse like hawks. But they didn't know what was coming. They hadn't seen the marauders yet. Elon's voice crackled through the earpiece in Danny's ear. Hold tight, Danny. We've got this. We're in position. Danny's hand tightened around the grip of his gun. He had to believe that. The marauders were the only reason they still had a shot at escaping. And if Elon Musk, of all people, was willing to risk it all for them, then they had to make it count. Just don't get us killed, Danny whispered back into the comms, trying to keep his voice steady. Claire gave him a sidelong glance. You think they'll back us up? Her voice was cool, but Danny could hear the underlying tension. They'd better, he said, his voice low. Elon's too smart to get caught in something he can't win. Just as the words left his mouth, a loud crash echoed through the night as a Marauder bike roared into the fray, the sound of its engine cutting through the storm like a bullet. Elon's voice came through loud and clear. "Let's get this party started." The Marauders had arrived. Suddenly, the night exploded. The sound of gunfire rattled through the streets as Elon and his team opened fire, their motorcycles weaving through the chaos, kicking up debris and forcing Hale's men to scatter. The chopper above them, which had been hovering just moments before, jerked to the side as a rocket-propelled grenade exploded near it, sending it spiraling into the sky in a fiery mess of smoke and debris. "We're in," Elon shouted through the comms, even as the sound of gunfire echoed in the background. "Move, Danny." Danny didn't need to be told twice. He bolted from his hiding spot, running toward the chaos with Claire right behind him. They reached the corner of the warehouse where the back exit opened into a narrow alley, but as they rounded the bend, a figure stepped out of the shadows, one they both recognized. Hale. He stood there, his gun drawn, his expression cold and calculating. "I knew you wouldn't make it out, Danny," Hale said, his voice laced with venom, "but I never expected Musk to get involved. You always did have more friends than you deserved." Danny's grip tightened around his gun, the weight of his weapon feeling both heavy and reassuring at the same time. Hale was a dangerous man, ruthless beyond measure. He had hunted Danny and Claire for weeks. This had been coming. But Danny wasn't the same man who had stepped into this fight weeks ago. He had learned, had grown, had become someone different. Someone who would make sure Hale never hurt anyone again. "You're going to pay for what you've done," Danny said, his voice firm, steady. Hale smirked, unfazed. "I don't think you're in a position to make demands, Danny. But let's see if you have the balls to pull that trigger." Before Danny could respond, a loud bang rang out, followed by another, and then the unmistakable roar of a motorcycle engine revving closer. "Elon." Hale turned just in time to see Elon Musk's motorcycle barrel toward him. With a swift motion, Elon pulled a high-powered assault rifle from his side, opening fire as he skidded to a stop in front of Hale. The bullet struck Hale's men, sending them scrambling for cover, but Hale himself didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled a knife from his belt and lunged at Elon, his movements fast and precise. "Watch out," Claire shouted, but before Danny could react, the two men collided in a fierce struggle, their knives flashing in the rain-soaked night. Elon's motorcycle slid across the wet ground, but he didn't seem to care. His focus was entirely on Hale. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Hale, with his cold, calculating eyes, fighting like a man possessed. Elon, focused and determined, like a force of nature. But this was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. Danny turned to Claire. "We need to help him." Claire nodded, already moving. She sprinted toward the fray, her gun raised. Danny followed closely behind, his heart racing in his chest. The struggle between Hale and Elon was intense, their movements a blur of skill and desperation. Hale had years of experience with hand-to-hand combat, but Elon wasn't exactly new to a fight either. Still, Hale had the edge. He was faster, stronger, and far more ruthless. "Elon," Danny shouted, closing the distance between them. "We need to finish this." But as he neared the fight, Hale's head whipped around, eyes narrowing as he saw Danny approach. With a savage growl, Hale shoved Elon aside and lunged toward Danny, his knife gleaming in the dim light. Time seemed to slow. Danny's instincts kicked in. He ducked low, avoiding the knife's deadly arc by mere inches, and in the same fluid motion, he drove his elbow into Hale's side. The force sent Hale stumbling backward, but the man was far from finished. Claire came up behind Hale, aiming her gun at his back. "Get down," she yelled. Danny didn't hesitate. He tackled Hale to the ground just as Claire fired, the shot ringing out in the night. The bullet grazed Hale's shoulder, but it was enough to give Danny the upper hand. With a swift movement, he disarmed Hale, sending the knife skittering across the wet ground. "Now," Danny growled, pinning Hale to the ground with all his strength. "Now you're done." Hale's eyes burned with fury. "You think this is over, Danny? You can't win. You never could." But Danny only tightened his grip. I'm not trying to win, Hale. I'm just trying to stop you. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over them. Elon was back on his feet, gun in hand, and without a word, he aimed directly at Hale's head. You're not going anywhere, Elon said, his voice icy. For a moment, Hale hesitated. He was beaten, broken, cornered. There was nowhere left to run. With a snarl, he spat on the ground in front of him. Do it, Hale sneered. But know this, you'll never be free of me. But before Elon could pull the trigger, Danny stepped forward. His hand hovered over Elon's arm, stopping him. No, Danny said, his voice low but firm. Not like this. For the first time in weeks, Hale seemed to realize his fate. His smug expression faltered, replaced with a glimmer of fear. He was done. The years of manipulation, the bloodshed, it was over. Elon looked at Danny, then lowered his gun, nodding in understanding. It's your call, Danny. Danny stood tall, looking down at the man who had been a shadow over his life for so long. Take him in, he said. Let him rot in prison where he belongs. As the marauders secured Hale and his men, the rain finally began to let up, leaving behind a city that seemed, for the first time in ages, to breathe a little easier. Danny and Claire stood together, looking out at the remnants of the battle. The warehouse was still standing, though it had taken its share of damage. But they had made it. They had survived. You did it, Claire said quietly, her voice filled with admiration. We did it. Danny nodded, his eyes on the horizon. Yeah, we did.